Across the rolling hills, the ancient woodlands, and the fog-draped valleys of England, the land itself seems to hum with memory. Villages that stand today on cobbled streets and stone foundations rest upon layers of forgotten histories, where belief and superstition shaped every corner of life. To walk in the countryside is to step across a patchwork of stories, where each hill, hollow, and river has been given voice by centuries of imagination. This is not merely geography, it is a landscape of myth, one where spirits and strange creatures were once thought to linger just beyond the reach of torchlight. The people who lived here long ago saw their surroundings as alive with unseen presence. The deep green forests of Sherwood and Dean, the lonely heaths of East Anglia, and the chalk downs of southern England were not empty spaces. They were stages where beings could appear at any moment, black dogs lurking by crossroads, lights drifting across treacherous marshes, or shadowy figures crossing a moonlit field. Folklore grew not from idle invention, but from attempts to make sense of the sudden and the unexplained. A sound carried on the wind with no visible cause, the gleam of eyes in the hedgerow, or the uneasy feeling of being watched on a deserted path. These were experiences given names, forms, and narratives, ensuring they could be understood, if not controlled. In this landscape, boundaries were everything. Crossroads, bridges, churchyards, and rivers were not only physical crossings, but also thresholds between the everyday and the uncanny. These places drew stories because they were never entirely safe. At night, villagers whispered that spirits favoured these spots, waiting for the unwary. The folklore of England is rich with tales where stepping across a boundary, whether a gate on the moor or the edge of a churchyard, meant entering the realm of another power, sometimes protective, sometimes hostile. The stories themselves often carried lessons. A warning about the marsh lights was also a reminder not to wander off known paths at night. Tales of water spirits pulling children into rivers became lessons to stay clear of dangerous banks. Legends of spectral dogs meeting lonely travelers served as reminders of mortality and the uncertainty of life. Folklore was never simply entertainment. It was instruction coded into memory, teaching caution, humility, and respect for forces greater than human control. This sense of the land being animated by powers older than man persisted even as villages grew, towns expanded, and Christianity reshaped belief. Churches were built upon ancient sites, but even within their shadows, people continued to whisper of the other presences that lingered nearby. Many of the myths we will explore were not erased by organized religion, but absorbed, adapted, and reshaped. The terrifying Black Hound could be seen as a demon or as a ghostly guardian. The fairies of lonely hills might be dismissed as heathen spirits, yet they remained in the tales of ordinary people for centuries. What is striking about English folklore is its diversity across regions. In Yorkshire, the moors birthed one set of stories, while the marshes of East Anglia offered another. The West Country nurtured tales of piskies and shape-shifting spirits, while the northern counties held fast to their stories of giants and phantom armies. Each community used folklore to explain the particular challenges of its environment. The farmer facing sudden floods in Somerset told different tales than the shepherd guiding flocks on the Cumbrian fells. Yet all shared the conviction that unseen beings could influence daily life, often in sudden and dramatic ways. Travellers who recorded these beliefs noted the seriousness with which they were told. In the 17th and 18th centuries, collectors described how villagers would swear with absolute certainty that they had seen the black dog crossing a road, or that a light had danced before them in the fen. Even when the age of reason began to question superstition, these stories endured, too deeply rooted in cultural memory to vanish. They survived in oral tradition, passed down by grandmothers by the hearth, or by farmhands during winter evenings, until they eventually made their way into the printed collections of antiquarians and folklorists. The persistence of these tales reveals something profound about the English imagination. For all the changes of kings and governments, for all the growth of cities and the advance of science, the sense of the land as haunted never truly disappeared. Even today, local legends remain part of identity. Villages in Suffolk still speak of their black dog, just as they did centuries ago. Lakes in Lancashire carry stories of lurking monsters, while old manor houses boast their guardian skulls. Each tale ties the present community to the shadowy echoes of the past. What makes the English landscape so evocative for folklore is its physical depth of history. Standing stones from prehistory, Roman ruins, Saxon churches, and Norman castles all lie within sight of one another. Each layer has its own stories, yet together they create a terrain saturated with myth. A ruined abbey on a hill might be seen as the dwelling of ghosts, while a prehistoric mound becomes the entrance to the other world. The sheer accumulation of time gives weight to the tales, making them feel less like invention and more like inherited truth. When we look at the creatures and spirits that populate English folklore, we find they are not random. They emerge from the environment itself. Marshes produce their treacherous lights, forests their hidden men and trickster fairies, coastlines their spectral ships, and moors their phantom hounds. The landscape does not simply frame the tales, it generates them. And because the land endures, so too do the legends. This exploration is not just a catalogue of strange creatures, but a journey through the way people once understood their world. To learn about the black dog is to glimpse the fear of sudden death on lonely roads. To hear of Jenny Greenteeth is to understand the dangers of deep ponds for children. To encounter the green man carved in church stonework is to feel the persistence of pre-Christian reverence for nature. These beings and myths were not isolated fantasies. They were expressions of human responses to danger, loss, hope, and wonder. As we begin to move deeper into this world, the stories will lead us from region to region, each with its own flavor of belief. Some will terrify, others will caution, and a few will even comfort. Together they form a mosaic of English imagination, one that continues to influence culture in ways both subtle and direct. The ghost stories of modern England, the imagery in literature from Shakespeare to Dickens, even the monsters that appear in contemporary films and games, many find their roots in these older beliefs. The land of England is not simply soil and stone, it is a repository of voices. When the mist curls across a fen, when a ruined tower casts a shadow across a field, or when a hollow tree creaks in the wind, the stories stir again. They are not relics locked in the past, but living presences carried in memory, waiting for anyone willing to listen. And so we turn now from this broader sense of the land and its atmosphere to the first of its most enduring figures, the spectral black hounds that prowl crossroads, lanes, and coastal paths. These dogs, with eyes burning like coals and paws that leave no mark, embody both fear and fascination, and their legends have endured across centuries of English storytelling. On the lonely roads of England, where the hedgerows close in tight and the moon casts long shadows, there are stories of a beast that walks beside travellers, a creature feared for centuries and remembered in countless regional variations. The black dog is perhaps the most famous and widespread figure of English folklore, appearing in tales from Yorkshire to East Anglia, from the moors of Devon to the lanes of Kent. Each region has its own name for the spectral hound, but all share common traits. A massive dog, blacker than night, with eyes that burn red or green, and a presence that chills the blood of any who encounter it. The black dog has been called many things. In Suffolk and Norfolk, it is Black Shuck, a terror whose appearance foretells death. In Yorkshire, it takes the name Barghest, a monstrous spirit with claws and fangs sharper than any earthly animal. Along the coastlines, it might be known simply as the Hellhound. And in smaller towns, it is sometimes reduced to the simple title of the Ghost Dog. Despite these differences, the core image is consistent. A supernatural canine, larger than any mortal beast, whose presence cannot be mistaken for anything ordinary. One of the oldest and most chilling accounts comes from East Anglia in the 16th century. In 1577, a violent storm swept across the region, striking churches with lightning and terrifying communities. Within this storm came a tale that would be retold for centuries. In the town of Bungay, worshippers gathered in St. Mary's Church were shaken as thunder roared overhead. Suddenly, a massive black dog was said to burst through the doors, eyes blazing, moving with impossible speed down the aisle. Witnesses swore that it seized two people, breaking their necks before vanishing in a flash of fire. On the very same day, in the nearby village of Blithburg, another church was struck. There too, the beast appeared, tearing through the congregation before departing, leaving behind claw marks scorched into the wooden doors. Marks that some claim can still be seen to this day. This event fixed Black Shuck in the imagination of East Anglia, a figure forever tied to storms, churches, and sudden death. But Black Shuck was not confined to one story. For centuries afterward, fishermen along the Norfolk coast told of seeing the dog pacing the cliffs on stormy nights, its eyes glowing against the spray of the sea. Farmers spoke of encountering it on country lanes, where it would fall into step beside them in eerie silence. Sometimes it would vanish after a few yards. Other times, it would remain until the traveller reached home, disappearing only when the door was shut. To see the dog was considered a terrible omen, a warning that someone close to the witness would soon die. Yet the beast itself rarely caused harm directly. Its terror lay in its symbolism, a messenger of mortality rather than a killer. In Yorkshire, the Barguest carried a slightly different reputation. Here, the black dog was larger, more monstrous, sometimes described with enormous claws, or even chains dragging behind it. The Barguest haunted roadsides, bridges, and graveyards, preying upon those foolish enough to wander after dark. One particularly feared spot was near Troller's Gill, a limestone gorge where the creature was said to dwell. To see the Barguest, there was not merely an omen, but a death sentence, for its gaze was believed to bring illness or sudden collapse. Villagers told of hearing its heavy paws behind them, though no dog was visible when they turned. The Barguest could also shift its form, appearing as a headless man, a white cat, or a monstrous bear. This ability to change shape made it even more terrifying, for no one could be certain what lurked in the shadows until it was too late. Further south, in Devon, the black dog took on the name Witch-Hares, and in some places was tied to the wider legend of the Wild Hunt. On stormy nights, people swore they could hear the baying of ghostly hounds sweeping across Dartmoor, led by a shadowy huntsman. Anyone caught outside risked being swept up in the spectral chase, carried far from home, or struck dead from terror. Dartmoor is a landscape that breeds such stories, vast, windswept and desolate, where fog rolls across the tors and the wind carries strange howls. Even today, hikers speak of uneasy feelings there, the sense of being watched or followed by something unseen. Not all black dog stories were purely terrifying. In some traditions, the spectral hound could act as a protector. In Lincolnshire, tales were told of a black dog that would walk alongside lonely travellers at night, ensuring they reached their destination safely before vanishing without harm. In these accounts, the dog was less a demon and more a guardian spirit, perhaps the ghost of a faithful animal that lingered beyond death. This dual nature is part of what makes the legend so enduring. The black dog could be an omen of death, a bringer of doom, or a silent companion offering safety. Which it would be was never certain, and that uncertainty itself created fear. Folklorists who studied the black dog in the 19th century began to notice connections between these stories and older beliefs. In Norse mythology, great hounds guarded the gates of the underworld, and in Celtic lore, spectral dogs guided souls into the afterlife. England, lying between these cultural spheres, absorbed and reshaped both traditions. The church, too, had its influence. Dogs were often seen as liminal creatures associated with graveyards and the supernatural. When Christian preachers condemned old beliefs, the black dog became tied to ideas of the devil and hellfire. Thus, the spectral hound became a figure at once pagan and Christian, folkloric and theological. Accounts of black dog sightings continued well into modern times. In the 20th century, newspapers reported villagers in Norfolk claiming to see a giant dog on back roads, its eyes glowing as bright as lanterns. Some motorists swore their cars passed through the beast as though it were made of smoke. Others described hearing its howl echoing across the marshes without any visible animal nearby. These reports kept the legend alive, transforming it from ancient superstition into a living tradition, a reminder that folklore is not bound to the past, but continues to evolve with each generation. One striking feature of black dog legends is their attachment to specific places. A lane in Essex might be known as Dog's Lane, where locals refuse to travel after dusk. A bridge in Yorkshire might be avoided because it was said the Barghest lurked there. These stories gave the landscape a supernatural map, marking dangerous spots where the veil between worlds was thinner. To know the local black dog tale was to understand where not to walk alone, or which paths required extra caution. In this way, folklore shaped behaviour, guiding communities through both real and imagined dangers. The black dog also influenced literature. Writers from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to contemporary novelists drew upon the imagery of spectral hounds. The most famous example is The Hound of the Baskervilles, in which Doyle used the legend of Dartmoor's ghostly hounds to create a tale of terror and mystery. Though the story ultimately revealed a rational explanation, the power of the myth was undeniable. The image of a giant, glowing-eyed dog stalking the moors became fixed in the public imagination, cementing the black dog as one of the most iconic figures in English folklore. Beyond literature, the black dog has become a cultural symbol. In some communities, pubs bear its name, their signs painted with snarling hounds. Bands and artists have adopted the figure, drawn to its mixture of fear and fascination. Even in psychology, the phrase, "the black dog," has come to represent depression, echoing the sense of a dark presence that walks silently beside a person. In this way, the folklore has transcended its origins, finding new meanings while retaining its old power. Despite centuries of retelling, the core of the legend remains unchanged. A great black dog seen at night, whose presence cannot be ignored. To meet it is to feel the weight of something beyond ordinary life, whether that weight is doom, protection, or a reminder of mortality. These dogs stand at the crossroads of fear and mystery, guardians of boundaries, omens of endings, and companions of the lonely. From the churches of Suffolk scarred by claw marks, to the moors of Yorkshire echoing with phantom footsteps, from the cliffs of Norfolk to the lanes of Devon, the black dog remains one of the most persistent and powerful figures in English folklore. Its stories prepare us to move further into the shadowed landscape of belief, where other lights flicker and lead the unwary astray, where the marshlands hold secrets, and where the will-o'-the-wisp dances to lure travellers from the safety of the road. In the low-lying marshes and fenlands of England, where the ground is soft and treacherous and the air hangs heavy with mist, strange lights have long been reported drifting across the darkness. These flickering glows, appearing just above the boggy earth or over hidden pools, are known by many names, but the most familiar is the will-o'-the-wisp. For centuries, travellers told of sudden lights dancing ahead of them, moving just out of reach, beckoning them away from the safety of the road. What made these accounts so compelling was not only their consistency, but also their consequences. To follow the wisp was to risk becoming hopelessly lost, swallowed by the marsh and drowned in silence. The earliest descriptions already carry a tone of warning. In medieval and early modern England, people firmly believed that these ghostly flames were not natural but spiritual in origin. Some said they were carried by mischievous fairies, playing tricks on mortals who dared to cross the wetlands at night. Others insisted they were the souls of the damned, forced to wander in the dark for their sins, carrying their lights as eternal punishment. To those who told the stories, there was little doubt of the intent. These lights were deceivers. Their purpose was to lure, to mislead, to destroy. One of the most common motifs is of a lone traveller returning home late across the fen. Seeing a light in the distance, he mistakes it for a cottage window or the lantern of another traveller. Desperate for warmth or guidance, he follows. The light keeps moving, always a little farther ahead, until he realizes too late that he has strayed into deep water or treacherous ground. His cries go unheard, and by morning, only reeds and ripples mark the place where he vanished. These were the stories repeated in village after village, reinforcing the danger of trusting any strange glow in the marsh. Names for the phenomenon varied by region. In the West Country, people spoke of pixie lights, connecting them to the trickster fairies of Devon and Cornwall. In East Anglia, they were sometimes called hinky punks or hobby lanterns. The term will-o'-the-wisp itself comes from will of the torch or will of the flame, imagining a wandering figure named Will who carried the deceptive light. Each name carried its own local flavour, but the essence was the same, a phantom flame that could not be trusted. Folklore offered explanations for who or what Will might be. One popular tale described him as a sinful man, denied entry to both heaven and hell. Condemned to roam the earth, he carried a burning ember from hell itself, lighting the way for none but himself, and leading others astray in the process. In some regions, the figure was not Will, but Jack, producing the name Jack-o'-lantern. These characters gave human shape to the mysterious lights, grounding them in a narrative of punishment and eternal wandering. The association between will-o'-the-wisps and moral lessons was strong. To see the lights was not only a physical danger, but also a spiritual warning. They reminded listeners that sin led to unrest even after death, that greed or wickedness could doom a soul to endless wandering. In this way, the lights served as both cautionary tales and supernatural threats, reinforcing community values while terrifying the imagination. Beyond the moral frame, the lights were also deeply tied to the land itself. The English fens, marshes, and bogs were genuinely dangerous places, even to those who knew them well. Paths shifted, pools appeared where none had been before, and fog could disorient even the most experienced traveller. By encoding the danger into a story, communities created a memorable way to ensure caution. The tale of the Wisp was more effective than a dry warning about hidden pools. To fear the dancing light was to remember never to stray from the known path. Interestingly, not all accounts painted the lights as entirely malevolent. In some stories, particularly from the West Country, the lights could be protective, appearing to guide travellers to safety rather than doom. These friendlier versions were rare but notable, showing how folklore could shift depending on the needs of a community. Where the marsh was especially perilous, the light was more often a trickster. Where paths were somewhat safer, it could become a guiding presence. The ambiguity only added to the mystery, since no traveller could know for sure which kind of light they had encountered. The phenomenon was so persistent that it eventually drew the attention of natural philosophers and scientists. By the 18th and 19th centuries, researchers suggested that the lights were caused by marsh gases, particularly methane and phosphine, igniting spontaneously when exposed to air. These explanations made sense, especially given the decaying vegetation and stagnant water of the fens. Yet for villagers who had seen the lights with their own eyes, scientific theories did not erase the older beliefs. To them, the will-o'-the-wisp remained a supernatural warning, a presence that no simple chemistry could fully explain. Accounts of the lights often blended natural description with the uncanny. Witnesses spoke of flames that hovered a few feet above the ground, moving slowly at first, then darting away if pursued. Some swore they changed colour, shifting from pale blue to green to white. Others claimed they made faint sounds, like distant laughter or whispering voices. The lights were said to vanish the moment a traveller tried to approach too closely, reappearing again farther away. Such details gave the stories vividness and made them impossible to dismiss as mere imagination. In some communities, the will-o'-the-wisp was also connected to treasure. People believed the lights hovered above hidden hoards buried in the earth, perhaps left behind by ancient kings, robbers, or even Roman soldiers. To dig where the light appeared was tempting, but the stories warned that such greed always led to disaster. Either the ground would collapse, swallowing the digger, or the light would vanish just as the treasure was nearly reached, leaving the seeker empty-handed. Here again, the folklore blended caution with moral teaching, discouraging reckless or selfish behaviour. Writers drew heavily on these traditions. Shakespeare referenced ignis fatuus, the Latin term for foolish fire, in his works. Later authors used the lights as symbols of deception, false hope, or supernatural mystery. The image of a flame flickering in the distance, promising salvation but delivering ruin, proved powerful across literature, from romantic poetry to Gothic novels. The will-o'-the-wisp became not only a rural legend, but also a metaphor for human folly, the pursuit of illusions that lead only to destruction. Modern encounters with strange lights in marshy areas continue to be reported, though often reinterpreted through new lenses. Some attribute them to natural gas, others to reflections of distant lamps, still others to paranormal activity. What is striking is that the language of folklore often persists in these reports. Even those who do not fully believe in fairies or wandering souls still describe the lights as will-o'-the-wisps, showing how deeply the old stories remain embedded in cultural memory. For people living centuries ago, however, the matter was not symbolic, but very real. To them, The wisp was a presence they could encounter on any misty night, a danger as tangible as quicksand or sudden storm. And so, the legend endured, shaping how communities viewed their marshes and reinforcing the idea that the world at night was alive with forces beyond human control. From the glowing lights of the fenlands, the imagination moves naturally to the figures who guard the forests and fields, spirits tied not to water or flame, but to the living heart of the woods. Among these figures, none is more enduring or more enigmatic than the Green Man, a face of leaves carved into stone and remembered as the very spirit of nature itself. Across the churches and manor houses of England, carved into wood and stone, there appears a face unlike any other. It stares out with wide eyes, its mouth often open as if breathing or speaking. But what makes it remarkable is that the face is made not of flesh, but of leaves. Branches curl around the brow, vines spill from the mouth, and foliage frames the cheeks. This figure, repeated hundreds of times across the country, is known today as the Green Man. Though his exact origins remain debated, his image has become one of the most enduring symbols of England's connection to the natural world, embodying the belief that the forest itself has spirit and voice. The Green Man is not a single tale, but an image, a motif that appears in medieval architecture from the 11th century onward, and likely draws upon ideas much older. His leafy face can be found in parish churches, on cathedral columns, in stained glass, and even hidden in the carved beams of village pubs. The variety is striking. Some faces are serene, with leaves gently unfurling from the lips. Others are wild, almost monstrous, with foliage bursting violently from nose and mouth, as though nature is overwhelming the human form. The range of expressions shows the many ways people understood this figure, as guardian, as reminder, as warning. Folklorists in the 19th and 20th centuries began calling him the Green Man, but in truth the people of the Middle Ages left little written explanation. His meaning must be read in context, and that context points strongly to an enduring reverence for nature. In an age when survival depended on the land, its harvests, its forests for timber, its pastures for animals, it is unsurprising that people would give form to the idea of a living, breathing world. The Green Man was a visual expression of that belief. He represented the cycle of growth and decay, the endless renewal of spring, and the certainty that the forest would endure long after individual lives had passed. To understand why his image appears so often in churches, we must recall how deeply pagan and Christian traditions intertwined in England. For rural communities, older reverence for trees, groves, and sacred springs did not vanish with the spread of Christianity. Instead, it was often reshaped. The church may have adopted the leafy face as a way of acknowledging the enduring presence of the natural world, while reframing it within Christian stonework. Parishioners could look up at the carvings and see not only an ornament, but a reminder that the God they worshipped was also the creator of fields, forests, and harvests. For others, the image may have carried more hidden meaning, a subtle survival of older beliefs that never fully died. The link between the Green Man and fertility is strong. Many carvings show leaves sprouting from his mouth like seeds bursting forth from soil. Others show vines curling in endless loops, echoing the cycles of planting and reaping. Farmers would have seen in this face a reflection of their own dependence on the rhythm of the seasons. If winter meant scarcity, the return of greenery in spring meant life renewed. The Green Man embodied this cycle, his eternal leafy face a reassurance that no matter the hardship of one year, the land would bring growth again. But the Green Man was not only a benevolent figure. In some depictions, his expression is fierce, almost menacing. Leaves erupt violently, choking the human features beneath. These images suggest another truth, that nature is not only nurturing, but also overwhelming. Forests could shelter but also conceal threats. Crops could thrive but also fail with devastating results. Storms, droughts, and disease reminded medieval communities that the natural world was not theirs to command. The Green Man's darker faces reflect this duality, a reminder that humans lived not above, but within the natural cycle, subject to forces they could never fully control. Beyond churches, the idea of a spirit of the forest appears in countless English folk traditions. In May Day celebrations, villagers dressed a chosen figure in leaves and greenery, creating the image of a living embodiment of spring. These celebrations often merged with the figure of Jack in the Green, a costumed dancer covered entirely in foliage who paraded through the streets in the 18th and 19th centuries. Though the custom came later, it clearly drew upon the same symbolism. A man transformed into nature, carrying the promise of renewal. Jack in the Green became especially popular among chimney sweeps in London and other cities, but his origins lie in older rural festivities that honoured the turning of the seasons. Other folklore connects the Green Man to forest guardians and wild men who appear in English stories. The Wild Man of the Woods was a stock character in medieval pageantry and storytelling, a hairy, untamed figure who lived outside civilization, both feared and respected for his closeness to nature. Like the Green Man, he represented the power of the wilderness, something dangerous yet also vital. These figures often appeared in morality plays, reminding audiences that while civilization was necessary, humans must never forget their dependence on the wild. It is easy to see why modern imagination has embraced the Green Man so strongly. His face carved into church walls offers a tangible connection to a time when belief in the spirit of nature was woven into daily life. To walk into an old English parish and find his leafy stare above a doorway is to encounter centuries of continuity, a reminder that the natural world was always present, even in places dedicated to worship of the divine. Today, his image has become a broader cultural symbol, representing ecological awareness, the bond between humanity and the environment, and even resistance to industrialization. But in medieval England, he was part of a living system of belief, a presence that spoke directly to the concerns of survival, fertility, and respect for the land. Accounts of personal encounters with forest spirits, though rarer than Black Dog or Marshlight tales, also circulated in rural England. Farmers told of hearing voices in the woods, of seeing shapes move among the trees that could not be explained by animals. Some swore that certain groves had an atmosphere of watchfulness, as though the trees themselves were aware of intruders. These impressions fed into the idea of the Green Man, not only as a carved face but as a real presence. To disturb certain groves, to cut down certain ancient trees, was to risk misfortune, as though the spirit of the forest would take revenge. Such beliefs lingered well into the 19th century, when reports still surface of communities reluctant to fell certain oaks or yews because of their sacred reputation. In addition, the Green Man's presence in carvings connected directly to funerary symbolism. Many appear in proximity to tombs and grave markers. This suggests a link between his leafy form and the idea of rebirth after death. Just as nature renews itself each spring, so too might the human soul find renewal beyond the grave. In this way, The Green Man was not only about crops and forests, but also about mortality and hope for continuity. His face was both a reminder of life's fragility and a promise of regeneration. The endurance of the Green Man in English tradition shows how powerful the imagery of nature can be. Unlike specific ghosts or regional monsters, his face does not belong to one village or one story. Instead, it belongs everywhere the natural world dominates human life, which in medieval England was everywhere. Each community, from the smallest hamlet to the greatest cathedral city, could understand the message carried by his leafy features. Whether comforting or threatening, he reminded them of the inescapable truth that life itself flows from the cycles of nature. This presence carries forward into other legends of England, where beings of the land and wilderness take form as giants, as guardians of hills, or as opponents to human settlement. From the leafy face of the Green Man, the imagination steps naturally to the vast figures said to stride across the hills and moors, giants whose stories were carved not in wood or stone, but in the very shape of the land itself. Among the oldest and most imposing figures in English folklore are the giants. Their stories stretch back to the earliest chronicles of the land, appearing in medieval histories, local legends and folk tales that were still told by firesides long after belief in such beings had faded. Giants were a way of explaining the vastness of the landscape, the enormous earthworks that dotted the countryside, and the sense that England itself bore the marks of beings larger and older than ordinary men. They were enemies, builders, guardians, and in many traditions, the first inhabitants of the island. To speak of them is to reach into the deepest layers of English myth. One of the most famous names tied to the giants is Gogmagog. His story was first recorded in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia in the 12th century, a pseudo-history that blended myth and legend into a sweeping account of Britain's past. According to Geoffrey, when the Trojan exile Brutus and his followers landed on the island, they found it inhabited not by ordinary humans, but by a race of giants. Chief among them was Gogmagog, a creature of immense strength and ferocity. In the tale, the giants waged war against the newcomers, but were defeated. Gogmagog himself was captured and forced to wrestle Coroneus, one of Brutus's champions. The struggle ended when Coroneus hurled the giant from a cliff into the sea, killing him and securing the land for the Trojans. This story was more than just entertainment. It placed giants at the very foundation of England's history, casting them as the primordial race whose defeat allowed civilization to rise. The name Gogmagog itself echoes biblical giants Gog and Magog, suggesting a fusion of biblical myth with local legend. Over time, the tale was retold and reshaped. In London, two great figures named Gog and Magog became associated with the city itself. Wooden effigies of them, carried in civic processions from the Middle Ages onward, symbolized guardianship of the capital. Even today, statues of Gog and Magog stand in the Guildhall, reminders of how deeply the imagery of giants is tied to English identity. Beyond the chronicles, giants were also used to explain ancient landmarks. Across England, massive earthworks, standing stones, and chalk figures carved into hillsides were attributed to the work of giants. The Cerne Abbas giant in Dorset, with his towering figure and club carved into the hillside, was said to represent a giant slain there. Large burial mounds were believed to be the resting places of giant kings. Stones too massive to move by human means were explained as the handiwork of beings whose size made such feats possible. By linking the land to giants, communities gave meaning to monuments they could not otherwise explain. the presence of giants was not always hostile. In some traditions, they acted as builders of churches and castles. Folklore often tells of stones dropped by giants on their way to construction sites, explaining why great boulders lie isolated in fields. In other tales, giants guarded treasures buried deep within hills, accessible only to those clever or brave enough to face them. Yet just as often, they were cast as cruel, dim-witted, and violent opponents for heroes to defeat in demonstrations of wit and courage. It is in this role that the figure of Jack the Giant Killer appears. Emerging in chapbook tales during the 18th century, Jack became one of the most popular English folk heroes. His stories, though later than the medieval chronicles, drew on much older motifs. Jack was always portrayed as clever, brave, and resourceful, a small man facing enormous opponents. His adventures took him across Cornwall and Wales, where he encountered a series of monstrous giants. Each giant was given distinct traits. Some were cannibals, some hoarded treasures, some terrorized entire communities, but all were larger than life and seemingly unbeatable. Jack defeated them not through brute strength, but through cunning. He tricked them into falling into pits, used traps and disguises, and turned their own power against them. His victories reflected a recurring theme in folklore, that intelligence and bravery could overcome size and force. For audiences in rural England, Jack was an appealing figure. He was not a king or a knight, but an ordinary man who outwitted extraordinary foes. His stories combined adventure with moral lessons about courage, cleverness, and persistence. The popularity of Jack the Giant Killer spread widely. By the 19th century, he had become a staple of children's literature, his tales adapted into forms more suitable for young readers. This shift softened the darker elements of the stories, cannibalism, brutal killings, and bloody battles. But the core idea remained: a small but clever hero triumphing over towering monsters. Jack's tales also blended with other traditions, influencing and being influenced by stories like Jack and the Beanstalk. While the latter had separate origins, the merging of motifs meant that for many people, Jack became the quintessential giant slayer, embodying England's ability to overcome overwhelming odds. Yet beneath the entertainment lay echoes of something older. The giants Jack defeated often represented chaos, greed, or destruction. By killing them, Jack was symbolically taming the land, ensuring that human communities could thrive. This mirrors the older myth of Brutus and Coroneus defeating Gogmagog, and even deeper myths found across Europe, where culture heroes overcome primordial monsters. The cycle suggests that giants in English folklore were more than just characters. They were embodiments of wild, untamed forces that had to be subdued for civilization to flourish. Local legends across the country add further richness. In Cumbria, tales tell of a giant who hurled boulders across valleys, leaving scattered rocks as evidence. In Cornwall, Tregeagle was remembered as a wicked giant condemned to endless labour, forced to empty a lake with a shell as punishment for his crimes. In Shropshire, the Wrekin Hill was said to have been created when a giant dumped a shovel of earth there. Each of these stories connects natural features to mythical beings, grounding folklore in the very shape of the land. Giants also served as moral exemplars in reverse. Their downfall often came from arrogance, gluttony, or cruelty. By exaggerating human flaws into monstrous proportions, the stories warned listeners against those same traits. A giant who devoured children might represent greed unchecked. One who hoarded treasure while others starved embodied selfishness. In this way, the tales reinforced community values. turning supernatural figures into tools for teaching. The image of the giant has never disappeared from English culture. From the medieval carvings and chronicles to modern children's books, they remain part of the imaginative landscape. They are found in literature, from Spenser's Fairy Queen to later fantasy novels, always representing forces larger than ordinary life. Their legacy survives not only in books, but in the very place names and landmarks of England, where hills, stones, and valleys carry echoes of the beings once believed to have shaped them. These stories of giants prepare the way for other myths of confrontation with monstrous forces, particularly those involving dragons. If giants embodied the wildness of the land, dragons came to embody its deepest dangers, combining the destructive force of nature with the moral threat of sin and corruption. From Jack's cunning victories to St. George's legendary battle, the step from giants to dragons is a natural one, as both represent the challenges humanity faced in taming its world and defining its place within it. Across England's folklore, few creatures are as imposing or as enduring as the dragon. They are beasts of fire, smoke, and terror, their enormous forms imagined coiling through caves, spreading wings over villages, or lying in wait beside rivers and marshes. Dragons, in English tradition, are not just monsters to be feared. They are challenges to be overcome, symbols of chaos that require courage, faith, and cunning to defeat. When people speak of dragon slaying in England, the first name that rises is St. George, but his story is only one part of a far larger tradition of English dragons, each rooted in the landscape and memory of local communities. The tale of St. George is well known. A knight of Christian legend, George is said to have arrived in a city plagued by a monstrous dragon. The beast demanded daily sacrifices, and when all the livestock were gone, the people turned to offering their children by lot. Eventually, the king's daughter was chosen, and as she went to meet her doom, George rode forth. Armed with faith and steel, he confronted the dragon, wounded it with his lance, and subdued it with the princess's girdle. Leading the creature back to the city, he slew it before the people, converting the kingdom to Christianity. The story, though first told in the Eastern Mediterranean, spread widely through Europe, becoming one of the most beloved saintly legends. By the Middle Ages, St. George was firmly established as the patron saint of England, his Red Cross banner symbolising not just victory in battle, but triumph over evil itself. What matters for folklore is how the image of George's dragon became linked with England's own landscapes. In villages across the country, people told their own dragon stories, often tying them to hills, caves, or rivers where strange shapes or natural hazards inspired fear. These local dragons rarely breathed fire in the way continental tales described, but they were no less dangerous. They were imagined as enormous serpents or worm-like creatures, sometimes winged, sometimes not, but always vast enough to terrify communities. The persistence of these stories suggests that the idea of the dragon spoke directly to real anxieties about famine, plague, natural disasters, and enemies that threatened from beyond. In Durham, one of the most famous tales is that of the Lambton Worm. According to legend, young John Lambton, heir to the local estate, skipped church one Sunday to go fishing in the River Wear. He caught a strange eel-like creature covered in slime, with sharp teeth and an unnerving gaze. Horrified, he flung it down a nearby well and went off to war. Years later, when he returned, he found the countryside in ruins. The creature had grown into a monstrous worm, coiling itself around hills and crushing villages, demanding cattle as food. none could defeat it, for when hacked to pieces, the fragments would rejoin. Desperate, Lambton sought the advice of a local wise woman. She told him he must cover his armor in sharp spikes and fight the worm in the river, where the current would carry away the pieces. He obeyed, and after a terrible struggle, he slew the monster. Yet the tale ends with a curse. Because Lambton had disobeyed the wise woman's final instruction to kill the first living thing he saw afterward, his family was doomed to generations of misfortune. The Lambton worm story shows several key themes of English dragon lore. The dragon is tied to water, often imagined as a serpent of river or marsh. It grows from neglect or sin, reflecting moral lessons about disobedience. Its defeat requires not just bravery, but also special knowledge and ritual. And even in victory, there is often a cost, a reminder that taming such forces is never without consequence. Further south, in Essex, the tale of the Buel's dragon was told for centuries. Here, a monstrous creature with wings and deadly breath terrorized the countryside. It was said to have been so large, it left trails like cart ruts in the fields. Armed villagers tried to fight it, but only one man, armed with a great spear, succeeded in slaying it. The story was tied to specific landmarks, with locals pointing to the places where the dragon had supposedly rested. Like many such tales, it functioned as both entertainment and explanation, giving supernatural cause to unusual features in the landscape. In Sussex, the Knuckerhole dragon became a famous part of folklore. The Knuckerhole was a deep pool, believed bottomless, near Leominster. From its depths emerged a water dragon that preyed upon the community. Local versions of the story vary. In one, a knight slew it with a sword. In another, a clever man baked a poisoned pie, which the dragon devoured, dying in agony. Both endings reinforce the idea that dragons could be overcome either by brute strength or by wit, echoing the themes of heroes like Jack the Giant Killer. Even after the dragon's death, the pool remained a place of dread. People said its depths could not be measured, and livestock avoided its edge. The dragon may have been gone, but its presence lingered in the land. Another remarkable tradition comes from Wales, tied closely to English borders. The story of the red and white dragons, though Welsh in origin, influenced English imagination through Geoffrey of Monmouth's writings. In the tale, King Vortigern tried to build a castle at Dinas Emrys, but each night the walls collapsed. His advisors told him to find a child born without a father and sacrifice him. That child was Merlin, who instead revealed the true cause. Two dragons, one red and one white, were battling beneath the hill. The white dragon symbolized the invading Saxons, the red, the native Britons. When the red dragon triumphed, Merlin prophesied victory for the Britons. Though rooted in Welsh myth, this story fed into English chronicles, shaping the broader symbolism of dragons as representations of peoples and powers struggling for dominion over the land. Not all English dragons were linked to grand battles. Many were local, almost domestic in scale, tied to particular villages. In Hertfordshire, people spoke of a dragon slain near the village of Brent Pelham, where a memorial stone claimed to mark its death. In Devon, tales tell of a dragon haunting the hills near Tavistock, frightening travellers with its vast size and glowing eyes. These stories were often specific, giving names to the slayers and describing the monster's lair in exact detail. Such precision anchored the myths in local geography, making them part of the identity of each community. The persistence of dragon stories across so many regions suggests they served a deeper function. Dragons were not merely creatures of imagination, they were embodiments of fear and challenge. They represented famine when crops failed, plague when disease spread, fire when villages burned, or invaders when armies arrived. By casting these threats as dragons, communities could imagine them as battles to be fought and won. The act of slaying the dragon, whether by knight, farmer, or cunning trickster, gave hope that dangers could be overcome. St. George's legend, placed against this background, becomes all the more powerful. By adopting him as patron saint, England embraced the idea of the dragon slayer not just as a hero, but as a national symbol. His victory represented triumph over chaos, paganism, and evil, aligning England with the broader Christian world, while still speaking to the very local fears embodied in village dragon tales. The Red Cross of St. George, flying above English armies, carried not only religious meaning but also the assurance that chaos could be subdued, just as the dragon was subdued beneath his lance. Even after belief in dragons faded, the stories endured in ballads, plays, and later literature. Shakespeare alludes to dragon-like foes, Milton invoked the imagery in Paradise Lost, and countless later writers drew upon the symbol of the dragon slayer as a metaphor for courage. In the 19th and 20th centuries, collectors of folklore recorded surviving versions of village dragon stories, ensuring they would not be forgotten. Today, they continue to inspire modern fantasy, where English dragons remain among the most iconic creatures of the genre. The image of the dragon also connects directly to later traditions of spectral hunts and nocturnal riders. If dragons embodied chaos in monstrous form, the Wild Hunt embodied chaos in motion, a host of riders sweeping across the night sky, carrying with them terror and doom. From the single beast to the great procession, the imagination of England moved naturally from dragon slayers to the hunt that no mortal could escape. After the tales of dragons and the champions who fought them, there emerges another tradition that carried its own terror, one less about a single monstrous adversary and more about the unstoppable passage of an entire host. In many parts of England, people whispered of the Wild Hunt, a spectral cavalcade that swept through the night sky or across lonely fields, mounted riders accompanied by ghostly hounds, horns, and cries. Unlike dragons, the hunt was not something one could fight or slay. To witness it was to stand before powers far beyond human control, a rushing tide of spirits that brought dread, misfortune, and sometimes death. The legend of the Wild Hunt is not unique to England. Versions appear across Northern Europe, from Scandinavia to Germany, each shaped by local belief. Yet the English stories carry their own particular flavour, grounded in the landscape of the countryside and tied to figures both pagan and Christian. What unites them is the sense of overwhelming presence. The hunt was not seen as a vision, but as something that truly passed, filling the night with sound and movement, leaving behind silence in which no birds sang and no dogs barked. Descriptions of the hunt varied. Some spoke of a great company of horsemen racing through the clouds, their shapes glimpsed against the moon. Others described them as an army sweeping across the ground itself, their hooves and hounds' paws pounding the earth. The riders were often faceless or shadowy, yet unmistakably there, their cries carried on the wind like the echo of distant battle. Always, the hunt was accompanied by dogs, black or white, their eyes burning and their baying enough to freeze the blood. For those who claimed to have seen or heard it, the memory never faded. The leaders of the hunt were named differently across regions. In some traditions, it was led by Herne the Hunter, a spectral figure tied to Windsor Forest. Herne was said to be a ghostly huntsman, antlers upon his head, who appeared at night to lead his phantom riders. His story was recorded as early as Shakespeare who mentions him in The Merry Wives of Windsor, but oral tradition suggests it was far older. Herne was often portrayed as a cursed keeper of the forest, condemned to ride forever as punishment for betrayal or crime. To hear his horn was to know misfortune was near. In other accounts, the hunt was led not by Herne, but by ancient kings or lords, figures remembered for cruelty or violence, doomed to ride until the end of days. Some said it was King Arthur himself, not in glory, but in restless wandering. Others claimed it was a host of the dead, warriors who could find no rest, sweeping through the land as a reminder that war and bloodshed left scars beyond the grave. The identities may have shifted, but the meaning remained. The hunt was a force of the restless and the damned, a warning that death did not always bring peace. What made the hunt particularly terrifying was its effect on those who encountered it. To see it was rare, but to hear it was common enough that many people swore they had been caught near its path. The sound of horns in the distance, the rush of hooves, the barking of hounds, all heard on nights when no mortal riders were abroad, were taken as sure signs. Those who stood too close risked being swept up into the procession, carried miles away, or struck down dead. Some accounts told of people found wandering, dazed, unable to say where they had been, as though the hunt had carried them off and then released them. Others warned that to look directly upon the riders was fatal, and that the only safety lay in casting oneself face down upon the earth until the noise passed. There were also warnings not to interfere. To call out, to wave a torch, or to try to join the riders was to invite disaster. Some said that those foolish enough to shout at the hunt would be dragged along with it, vanishing forever. Yet there were rare stories of gifts, a rider dropping a token, a horse leaving behind a shoe, or a hound leaving a hare. These were said to bring fortune, but always with risk. Such tokens could just as easily be curses, and only those with special knowledge dared to use them. The wild hunt was most often seen in winter, especially around the time of Yuletide, when the nights were longest and the boundary between worlds was thought to be thin. This timing tied it closely to ideas of seasonal change, death, and renewal. Just as the fields lay barren and the cold stripped the land, the hunt swept across the skies, embodying the presence of death itself. Some linked it to storms, claiming that the rush of the hunt caused the roaring wind. Others connected it to plagues, seeing it as an omen that illness would strike. In every case, the hunt was not a neutral vision, but a bearer of consequence. The origins of the legend are tangled. Scholars have traced connections to old pagan myths of gods leading hunting parties across the skies, particularly the Germanic god Woden, who rode with his host during the stormy months. The echoes of this myth likely carried into England with the Anglo-Saxons, then blended with local traditions of restless spirits and ghostly armies. Over time, the church reshaped the stories, framing the hunt as the damned souls of sinners or demons riding to claim the wicked. Yet in the countryside, the older flavour remained strong. The hunt was the wild, unstoppable force of the supernatural, sweeping through fields and forests beyond the reach of any priest or king. Herne the Hunter deserves special attention as the most distinctively English figure tied to the hunt. His association with Windsor Forest rooted him in a specific place, and his antlered form carried echoes of older woodland deities or spirits of the chase. Stories described him as a keeper who had betrayed his master or been falsely accused, leading to his hanging beneath an oak tree. Ever after, his ghost was seen leading the hunt, his horns marking him as something more than human. Shakespeare's mention of him shows how widespread the story had become by the 16th century, and it continued to grow, making Herne one of the most recognizable faces of the English hunt. The wild hunt also intersected with other traditions, especially those of spectral animals. The black dogs that haunted lanes and crossroads were sometimes said to accompany the riders, their glowing eyes part of the terrifying procession. In this way, the tales of ghostly hounds and the hunt fed into one another, reinforcing the sense that the night was filled with dangers beyond mortal comprehension. A traveller who heard the baying of dogs might not know whether it was a lone black shuck or the full host of the hunt, and in either case, fear was the natural response. Despite its fearsome reputation, the wild hunt also served a purpose in folklore. It reinforced the dangers of being out at night, of wandering across lonely fields or forests after dark. In a time before artificial light, the night was genuinely perilous, with real risks of falling, becoming lost, or encountering wild animals. By embodying those dangers in the hunt, communities gave them form and voice, ensuring that people respected the hours of darkness. The story also carried moral weight, warning against arrogance, cruelty, or betrayal, since the leaders of the hunt were often portrayed as men who had been cursed for their sins. Even into the modern era, stories of the hunt persisted. In the 19th century, folklorists recorded accounts from rural communities where people swore they had heard the phantom riders. Some even claimed to have seen figures sweeping across the horizon, especially in stormy weather. The endurance of the tale speaks to its power, for even as scientific explanations for thunder and wind became common, the imagination still found in them the echo of galloping hooves. The image of the hunt has proven enduring in literature and art. Poets and novelists alike have drawn upon its imagery, portraying it as a symbol of death, fate, or the unstoppable passage of time. In modern fantasy, it appears again and again, its riders often recast as fairies, demons, or warriors of the dead. The persistence of the hunt shows that its essence, a host of supernatural riders sweeping through the night, is a motif too powerful to vanish. It speaks to something deep in human imagination, the fear of being caught up in forces larger than oneself, forces that move with relentless speed and leave no room for resistance. The tales of the hunt lead naturally into other stories of spirits who lived closer to home, in the hearths and barns of English villages. If the hunt was the great host that passed beyond human reach, then the hobgoblins and brownies were the intimate spirits, the ones who dwelled within households, helping or hindering the daily tasks of ordinary life. From the roar of the skies, the imagination turns inward, to the quiet, yet no less uncanny presences that shape the rhythm of rural living. If the wild hunt represented forces beyond human control, sweeping across the sky in terrifying grandeur, the hobgoblin and the brownie represented something closer to home, spirits whose presence was felt in the very places where people lived and worked. These beings belong not to distant hills or haunted crossroads, but to the hearth and the barn, where their influence could be seen in small everyday details. A churn of butter completed overnight, a stable inexplicably tidy, or grain swept neatly into sacks by unseen hands. Unlike dragons or phantom riders, these spirits did not terrify in their scale. They unsettled through their intimacy, their proximity to the household itself. They were at once helpful and dangerous, demanding respect, but offering protection and labor in return. The brownie was the more benevolent figure, widely remembered across England, Scotland, and parts of Northern Europe. In English tales, brownies were small, shaggy, or rough-featured beings, often no taller than a child, with long arms and a rustic appearance. They were said to be drawn to households where the family worked hard and treated them with a certain quiet reverence. A brownie, once attached to a home, would carry out chores during the night, mending clothes, sweeping floors, threshing corn, or feeding livestock. The family would awake to find the work completed, with no sign of who had done it. But this aid was never given freely in the modern sense. The brownie expected offerings, small gifts of food or drink, usually a bowl of cream, a piece of bread, or a pot of honey. These were not bribes, but tokens of respect, acknowledgements of the spirit's presence. To fail to provide them was to risk losing the brownie's favour. If slighted, the once helpful spirit might become mischievous, hiding tools, souring milk, or creating noise in the night. In some tales, the offended brownie would abandon the house altogether, leaving the family without its unseen helper. What made brownies so fascinating to rural communities was the way they blurred the line between the natural and the supernatural. On the one hand, they were imagined as spirits, part of the unseen world. On the other, they were deeply tied to practical, everyday concerns. A good harvest, a smoothly running household, and protection of livestock could all be attributed to the unseen hand of a brownie. In this way, belief in such beings gave families a sense of explanation for both good fortune and misfortune. Success was not only the result of human effort, but also of unseen cooperation. Failure might be the result of having offended the spirit. The hobgoblin was a close relative, though the name carried slightly different associations. Hobgoblins were often seen as more mischievous than brownies, inclined to play tricks even while offering help. The very word hob was a familiar one in English, used as a nickname for rustic or common folk, and combined with goblin, it suggested a creature both homely and otherworldly. Hobgoblins, like brownies, could be helpful in barns and kitchens, but they were also notorious for pranks. They might tangle hair, spill milk, or trip the unwary. In some accounts, they were fond of frightening those who stayed up too late, making noises or moving objects to unsettle the household. Yet despite this mischief, hobgoblins were rarely portrayed as evil. They were closer to tricksters, testing the patience and humility of those they served. A family that treated them with respect, leaving out offerings, speaking kindly of them, and not prying into their business, could enjoy their help for generations. But to insult or mock them was dangerous. Many tales warn against trying to give a hobgoblin clothes. While ordinary generosity might seem harmless, this act was taken as a grave insult. To offer clothes was to suggest that the hobgoblin's own rough appearance was shameful, and the spirit would vanish, never to return. This motif appears in countless stories, reinforcing the idea that these beings belonged to their own world and could not be treated as mere servants. The dual nature of brownies and hobgoblins, helpers and tricksters, protectors and pests, made them particularly resonant for rural families. Life in the countryside was precarious, dependent on weather, animals, and the delicate balance of labor. The idea that unseen forces might tip that balance one way or the other made sense in a world where outcomes were often unpredictable. A successful harvest could feel like a blessing beyond human effort, while a string of bad luck might be explained by the anger of the household spirit. These beliefs gave shape to uncertainty, offering a way to understand the rhythm of fortune and failure. Stories about these spirits were often shared by the fireside, blending humor with warning. A common tale might describe a brownie who worked diligently each night until a careless family member mocked him, at which point the spirit vanished, leaving the family to struggle with the work themselves. Another might describe a hobgoblin who frightened the household by making groans in the night, only to reveal himself in some harmless prank. These stories entertained while also reinforcing the importance of respect, humility, and gratitude. Regional variations abounded. In the north of England, brownies were sometimes called boggarts, though that word often carried a darker meaning, suggesting a more malevolent spirit. In Yorkshire, boggarts could be tied to specific families, haunting them wherever they moved, bringing mischief and misfortune. The line between helpful hobgoblins and dangerous boggarts was thin, reflecting the delicate balance of household spirits in general. A being that once aided a family could, with a change in circumstance or attitude, become a burden instead. In some parts of England, brownies and hobgoblins were tied to specific sites, bridges, mills, or farms, known for their association with the unseen. Travellers might be warned not to cross a certain bridge after dark because a hobgoblin was said to lurk there, waiting to play tricks. Millers might tell of a helpful spirit who kept the mill wheels turning smoothly, provided he was properly honoured. These localised traditions gave each community its own folklore, tying supernatural belief directly to the spaces where people lived and worked. The church's stance on such spirits was ambivalent. Some clerics condemned belief in brownies and hobgoblins as superstition, linking them to demons and urging people to reject them. Yet others tolerated the traditions, seeing them as harmless, or even as allegories for divine providence. The persistence of these beliefs suggests that, whatever the official teaching, rural families continued to honour their household spirits. For them, the evidence was too strong to ignore. Chores completed overnight, animals mysteriously tended, or unexplained mischief all pointed to a presence that could not simply be dismissed. As with many figures of English folklore, brownies and hobgoblins gradually softened in popular imagination. By the 19th century, they appeared in children's stories as quaint helpers, stripped of their darker aspects. Writers portrayed them as kind, loyal little beings who rewarded goodness and punished laziness, fitting neatly into Victorian moral tales. While this literary version preserved the idea of the helpful spirit, it lost much of the older ambiguity, smoothing away the unsettling edge that made the folklore so powerful. Yet in oral tradition, the darker side never fully vanished. Well into the 20th century, rural families in some areas still told of mischievous household spirits, blending humour with unease. Even as belief waned, the stories endured, shaping the way people thought about luck, labour, and the invisible forces that surrounded daily life. These intimate spirits connect closely to the next realm of English folklore, the Omen beasts, creatures whose appearance foretold disaster. If brownies and hobgoblins represented the unseen forces that could help or hinder within the home, then beings like the Barghest represented the larger, more frightening presences that haunted the edges of communities, marking the approach of death and doom. From the quiet chores of the brownie, the imagination moves outward again, into the darkness where the great spectral beasts waited. In the north of England, particularly in and around the city of York, there is a figure whose name was spoken with dread for centuries. Known as the Barguest, it was one of the most feared of the spectral black dogs, but it carried its own character, its own distinct place in the imagination of the people. The Barguest was not merely another form of the black Shuck or the wish-hound. It was the Omen beast of Yorkshire, and its presence was tied as much to death as to the very identity of the region's folklore. The Barguest was almost always described as a monstrous hound, larger than any earthly dog, with glowing eyes that burned red in the darkness. Its appearance was sudden and unmistakable, often on lonely lanes, bridges, or churchyards. Unlike some of the black dog tales where the animal might walk alongside a traveller without causing harm, the Barghest carried with it a sense of finality. To see it was to know that death was near, either for the one who witnessed it or for someone close to them. The beast was less a participant in events than a herald, a visible reminder of the inevitability of mortality. York itself, with its ancient walls and deep history, was the perfect home for such a creature. The city was already layered with centuries of ghost stories. Roman soldiers said to march through cellars, restless monks wandering ruined abbeys, and battlefields just beyond its streets. In such a place, the idea of an omen beast fit naturally. Local accounts place the Barguest prowling near the city gates, particularly at Micklegate Bar, one of the historic entrances to York. Travellers arriving after dark were warned to take care, for the hound was said to lurk there, waiting to cross their path. Its appearance meant no one should expect long life, for soon the death bell would toll. The Barghest was not limited to York itself. Tales spread across Yorkshire, placing the creature in rural lanes, on the moors, and near river crossings. A common theme was its connection to funerals. Some said the Barghest would appear near the house of a dying person, unseen by most but visible to those with second sight. Others claimed it would follow funeral processions, its presence confirming the transition of a soul. There were even stories of spectral skeletons or headless men accompanying it, as if the hound led a procession of the dead through the night. Unlike dragons or giants, which could be defeated by heroes, the Barghest was never slain. It was not an enemy to be fought, but a sign to be endured. Its power lay not in action, but in meaning. People feared it, not because it attacked, but because it revealed. Death itself could not be avoided, and the Barghest was the embodiment of that truth. To live in Yorkshire and know the stories of the hound was to live with a constant reminder that life was fragile, that fate could be glimpsed in the glow of spectral eyes at the roadside. The very name Barghest has sparked debate. Some link it to the German Barghest, meaning mountain spirit, suggesting a link to continental tales of spectral guardians. Others connect it to the word barrow, meaning burial mound, tying it to the dead who dwelled beneath the earth. Whatever its origin, the name carried weight. To speak of the Barghest was to invoke dread, and the word itself became shorthand for a portent of doom. What makes the Barghest especially fascinating is how its image broadened beyond that of a mere dog. While most accounts describe it as canine, some traditions insisted it could change its form, appearing as a monstrous bear, a headless man, or even a shapeless shadow. This ability to shift reinforced its role as an omen. It was not the creature itself that mattered, but the message it carried. Whether as hound or phantom, its presence meant the same, that death was close at hand. The Barghest was not alone in the pantheon of English omen beasts. Across the country, people spoke of animals that carried supernatural warnings. In some regions, spectral chickens were said to appear before death, their crowing heard in empty yards. In others, ghostly horses were believed to gallop past houses where someone was dying. But most common of all were the dogs. From the Black Shuck of East Anglia to the Padfoot of Wakefield, each region had its own version, tied to local roads and churchyards. The Barghest was simply the most notorious, the one whose name became a byword for dread. These beasts served important roles in the imagination of rural England. Death was an ever-present reality, often sudden and unexplained. Illness could strike without warning, accidents were common, and life expectancy was short. The idea that a visible sign might precede death gave a sense of order to what was otherwise chaotic. To say that the Barghest had been seen near a house was to prepare the community, to make sense of the loss that followed. It was a way of weaving death into the fabric of meaning, ensuring that it was not random but heralded by forces beyond human sight. Accounts of the Barghest persisted into the modern era. In the 19th century, antiquarians and folklorists recorded stories from Yorkshire villagers who swore the hound still roamed. Some described hearing its heavy paws on the cobbles, though no dog was visible. Others spoke of glowing eyes in hedgerows that vanished when approached. These reports show how deeply the legend endured, even as the industrial age transformed the landscape. In the shadow of mills and factories, the Omen beast of old still walked, its message unchanged. The Barghest also influenced literature. Writers of the Gothic tradition drew upon the imagery of the spectral hound, weaving it into tales of dread. The very idea of a black beast whose appearance foretold doom became a staple of ghost stories and novels, echoing through works long after belief in the literal creature had faded. The Barghest was not just a local legend, but part of the larger cultural vocabulary of fear, a figure that could be invoked to conjure an atmosphere of unease. Though it was feared, the Barghest was also respected. It was not hunted, not mocked, not challenged. Communities lived with the knowledge of its presence, shaping behavior and reinforcing a sense of humility before forces beyond control. In this sense, the Barghest and other Omen beasts served as moral as well as supernatural figures. They reminded people that life was finite, that death came for all, and that arrogance in the face of such truths was folly. From the Omen beasts of the north, the imagination turns naturally to the waters of England, where other dangers lurked. If the Barghest prowled lanes and churchyards, then creatures like the Grindylow and Greenteeth waited in rivers, ponds and pools, reaching out to drag the unwary beneath the surface. From glowing eyes in the hedgerows, the stories move now to the dark waters that shaped another set of fears and warnings across the English countryside. England's rivers, ponds and marshes have long been places of both sustenance and danger. They offered fish, transport and water for crops and animals, but they also held hidden perils. People drowned with alarming frequency, particularly children who played too close to the edges, or adults who slipped into the depths at night. To make sense of these dangers, communities peopled their waters with spirits, creatures who waited beneath the surface, ready to seize the unwary. Among these, 3 names appear again and again in English folklore: the Grindylow, Greenteeth, and Powler. These beings were not majestic river gods or ancient deities, but lurking, malevolent presences, remembered as vividly as any monster of land or sky. The Grindylow was perhaps the most widespread of these figures, described as small, green, and grotesque, with long arms and sharp fingers. The Grindylow dwelled in ponds and marshes, waiting for children who strayed too near. Parents used the creature as a warning, telling children that if they played by the water's edge, the Grindylow would reach up, seize them, and drag them down to their doom. The very name carried weight. To mention the Grindylow was to invoke the danger of drowning. For many rural families, this was no abstract fear, but a constant reality. Water claimed lives every year, and the folklore embodied that danger in a form children could understand. Descriptions of the Grindylow varied. Some said it was a humanoid shape, with bulging eyes and skin like slimy weeds. Others imagined it as more monstrous, with a twisted body and gaping mouth filled with teeth. Always its arms were emphasized, long, spindly, and unnaturally strong, able to clutch and pull with irresistible force. Stories often placed Grindylows in shallow ponds, particularly those with deceptive surfaces, where a layer of green algae might make the water look solid until it gave way beneath a careless step. By embodying these hazards in a creature, the tales created a vivid deterrent. Children were far less likely to test the water if they believed a monster lay beneath. Jenny Greenteeth was a closely related figure, remembered especially in Lancashire and the northwest. Like the Grindylow, she was a water hag, but her character carried an added edge of menace. Jenny was said to lurk just below the surface, her green skin and long hair blending with weeds and duckweed. She would wait silently, then snatch children or even adults who leaned too close, dragging them into the depths. Parents across the region used her name as a warning. Keep away from the water, or Jenny Greenteeth will have you. The effectiveness of such a tale was obvious. Even if a child doubted the existence of Jenny, the repeated warning associated her with danger, embedding caution in memory. What made Jenny Greenteeth particularly feared was her invisibility. Unlike a dragon or even a black dog, she could not be seen until it was too late. Her green colouring made her indistinguishable from pondweed, her hair drifting like plants in the current. To see Jenny was to have already been caught. This trait made her a perfect embodiment of the hidden dangers of water. Ponds and rivers might look calm on the surface, but beneath could be weeds, currents, or sudden drops. Jenny personified that unseen peril. In Durham and along the River Tees, another name was known: Peg Powler. Peg was often described as a hag with long green hair and sharp teeth, who haunted the river and dragged the unwary to their deaths. Unlike Jenny Greenteeth, Peg was associated specifically with the current of the Tees, her name becoming so well known that froth on the river was nicknamed Peg Powler's Suds. Parents told their children not to play by the river lest Peg pull them under. The detail of her hair, described as streaming green strands, was a vivid image, linking her to both weeds and drowning victims. In some accounts, she was also said to devour her victims once she had them beneath the water, making her even more terrifying. Together, Grindylow, Jenny Greenteeth and Peg Powler form a pattern. Each is tied to a specific danger: ponds, weedy shallows, or fast-flowing rivers. Each targets children most of all, though adults too were warned, and each uses fear as a preventative measure. In societies where survival depended on vigilance, stories like these ensured that warnings carried weight. A child might not understand the physics of drowning, but they would understand the image of a green hag pulling them down. Folklore gave language and form to danger. The idea of water spirits dragging the living to their deaths is far from unique to England, but what makes the English versions distinct is their domestic scale. These were not grand mythic beings ruling the seas or storming rivers. They were local threats, tied to the ponds behind the village or the river running through the fields. They were as much a part of daily life as barns or hedgerows. For villagers, these spirits were not distant legends, but present dangers, waiting in places they passed every day. There are also darker undertones to these tales. In some traditions, Jenny Greenteeth was said to particularly target the disobedient, children who ignored their parents' warnings. This made her not only a danger, but also a moral figure, punishing those who strayed from proper behaviour. Peg Powler, too, was sometimes described as seeking out the careless or the prideful. In this sense, the water spirits became enforcers of community values, ensuring obedience through fear. They were not random hazards, but consequences embodied. Reports of encounters, though often second-hand, persisted well into the 19th century. Folklorists collected accounts of people who swore they had seen shapes in the water, or who described strange splashes and disturbances when no one was present. The persistence of these details suggests that belief in such spirits remained strong even as scientific explanations became available. For those who lived by rivers and ponds, the sense of something uncanny in the water was too powerful to dismiss. The imagery of these spirits also found its way into literature. Children's stories of the 19th century often softened them into moral lessons, but the darker edge remained. In some poems and tales, Jenny Greenteeth was portrayed as a cautionary figure, while in others, she became almost symbolic of death itself, waiting silently beneath the surface. Even in modern times, the Grindylow was revived in fantasy fiction, showing how deeply embedded the image had become. Beyond their immediate function as warnings, these water spirits also connected to deeper cultural ideas. Water has always been seen as liminal, a boundary between worlds. Rivers marked the edges of territories, ponds were places of mystery, and wells were thought to reach into other realms. The beings who inhabited them embodied that sense of the in-between, creatures neither fully human nor entirely otherworldly, living at the threshold between safety and danger. To encounter them was to step across that boundary with fatal results. For communities who depended so heavily on water yet feared its power, these tales were essential. They ensured respect for the rivers and ponds, teaching that no one could treat them lightly. The Grindylow in the pond, Jenny Greenteeth beneath the weeds, and Peg Powler in the river were all reminders that the waters were alive with forces beyond human control. From the deep green rivers and ponds of England, where unseen hands reached out from below, the imagination turns once more to the fields and farms, where other transformations were said to occur. If water spirits punished children for carelessness, then in the countryside, witches were feared for taking on animal forms, especially the hares that darted across moonlit fields, swift and uncanny, forever tied to tales of magic and familiar spirits. Across the farmlands and moors of England, there is a creature whose ordinary presence in the countryside made it an especially unsettling vessel for the supernatural. The hare, quick and watchful, was common enough in fields and hedgerows, but in folklore it was anything but simple. For centuries, people believed that witches could take the shape of hares, using their speed and cunning to escape pursuit or to work mischief unseen. These were not merely stories told for amusement. They were explanations for misfortunes, for milk gone sour, for animals struck with illness, and for the strange encounters farmers swore they had witnessed in the early hours of morning. The Witch-Hare was one of the most vivid intersections of everyday rural life and the supernatural, blending the natural habits of the animal with the fears and suspicions that shaped English communities. The belief was widespread. In counties across England, from the flat fields of East Anglia to the rugged landscapes of Devon, people spoke of hares that could not be caught or killed by ordinary means. Hunters would describe chasing a hare across open ground, only to have it vanish suddenly, leaving no trace. Farmers swore that a particular hare always appeared near their barns when their cows gave little milk, or when the butter would not churn no matter how long they tried. When misfortunes multiplied, suspicion turned quickly to the idea that this was no ordinary animal, but a witch in disguise. The connection between witches and hares was strengthened by the animal's own qualities. Hares were elusive, able to vanish into hedgerows in a heartbeat. Their wide, staring eyes and sudden, almost unnatural stillness gave them an eerie air. Their association with fertility, producing many young and moving through fields at night, added another layer of strangeness. In a world where people already feared witches for their supposed power over fertility, harvests, and livestock, the hare seemed a fitting form for transformation. Tales of witch-hares often follow a similar pattern. A farmer or hunter encounters a hare behaving unusually, perhaps sitting too close to a house, or refusing to run even when approached. They attack it, usually with dogs or weapons, but the hare escapes despite wounds. Later, a local woman is found nursing the same injury, revealing her as the witch. Stories like these were common throughout England, reinforcing the belief that witches could not only assume the shape of animals, but could also transfer injuries between their bodies and those of their animal forms. A blow struck to a hare might cause a cut or bruise to appear on the suspected witch the next day, confirming what people already suspected. The connection between witches and hares was particularly strong in East Anglia, an area where witch trials in the 16th and 17th centuries were especially fierce. Witnesses in these trials often testified that accused women had appeared as hares or were accompanied by them. One account described a hare that could not be driven off no matter how many stones were thrown at it, only for the accused witch to be found later with unexplained bruises. Another told of a hare that led hunters on an impossible chase, crossing rivers and hedges until it disappeared, after which a suspected witch was found exhausted in her cottage. These stories were presented in court as evidence, treated as proof of the accused's supernatural power. Alongside the witch hare was the broader belief in familiars, animal companions or servants of witches, gifted to them by the devil or acquired through magical means. These familiars were not always hares. Cats, toads, ferrets, dogs, and even insects were also commonly named. Yet the hare stood out for its prominence and persistence in English folklore. In many trial records, the testimony of children or neighbours includes descriptions of witches being fed by their familiars, or of small animals appearing in suspicious ways around their homes. Familiars were said to suck blood from their mistress, receiving nourishment in exchange for service. They acted as spies, tormentors, and helpers, giving witches their power over both people and animals. The role of familiars in English folklore was both practical and symbolic. On the practical level, they provided explanations for misfortune, a sudden illness in livestock, a string of bad luck in farming, or a child's sickness could all be attributed to the work of a familiar spirit. On the symbolic level, they reinforced the idea that witches were not isolated, but were part of a larger network of the unnatural. The presence of an animal companion blurred the line between human and beast, making the witch seem all the more unnatural, someone who stepped outside the order of the world. The imagery of hares as familiars often crossed into ritual and superstition. Farmers might draw protective symbols on their barns to prevent witches from sending hares to steal milk. Cunning folk, the village practitioners of magic, were sometimes called upon to break the power of familiars, using charms or counterspells to drive them away. One popular belief held that shooting a witch hare with a silver bullet or pellet could kill it where ordinary weapons failed. Others believed that reciting certain prayers or carrying iron would ward off the familiar's influence. These practices reveal how real and pressing the belief was. People took practical steps to defend themselves from what they saw as genuine threats. Interestingly, Not all hares in folklore were negative. In some traditions, the hare retained a more neutral or even positive aspect, connected to fertility, the moon, and the cycles of nature. These associations, likely much older, were gradually overshadowed by the darker witch-hare stories, but never fully disappeared. Even so, in the tense climate of witch trials and suspicion, it was the sinister image of the animal that dominated. To see a hare too close to a cottage, or to find one sitting in a churchyard, was rarely taken as a benign sign. Familiar spirits themselves could blur the line between helper and tormentor. In some accounts, witches described their familiars as speaking to them, giving advice or urging them toward harmful deeds. Others spoke of them as burdens, creatures that demanded food or blood and punished their masters if neglected. This ambiguity reflected wider fears about magic itself. Power was attractive but dangerous, and those who wielded it were never entirely in control. The familiar, whether hare or other creature, embodied this danger, showing that alliances with the supernatural always came at a cost. Even after the height of witch trials passed, the tales of witch-hares endured. In the 18th and 19th centuries, rural people still told of hares that could not be caught, or of animals that led hunters on impossible chases before vanishing into thin air. In some places, the belief shaped behavior directly. Farmers who saw a hare too near their barns might cross themselves or mutter protective words. Hunters who killed a hare would check its body carefully, looking for signs that it was not entirely natural. By the Victorian era, the stories had shifted in tone. Writers began to collect and publish them as part of England's folk heritage, often treating them as quaint superstitions. Yet the power of the imagery remained strong enough that the hare's association with witches persisted in the popular imagination. Even today, to speak of a witch hare evokes the same sense of unease. An ordinary animal transformed into something uncanny, a reminder of the deep-rooted connection between the natural and the supernatural in English folklore. From the small, watchful eyes of the hare and the shadowy presence of familiars, the imagination moves outward once again, into the wider world of spectral figures that haunted the countryside. If the witch hare tested the safety of the farmyard and the familiar prowled unseen in the home, then the ghostly coaches and headless riders tested the courage of those who travelled England's roads at night, where silence could suddenly break with the thunder of wheels or the gallop of invisible horses. Travelling the roads of England after dark was never without its dangers, and not only because of thieves or wild animals. For generations, people told of encounters with phantom coaches, spectral carriages that thundered past in the night, drawn by horses no living man could control. Alongside them came the stories of headless riders, figures who appeared suddenly on lonely lanes or in shadowed churchyards, their presence a terrifying sign that the boundaries between the living and the dead were thin. These legends, repeated from county to county, blended fear of the supernatural with the very real perils of travel in earlier centuries, when the road at night could feel like a place outside the ordinary world. The phantom coach was one of the most striking images in English folklore. Accounts describe travellers hearing the sound first, the distant rumble of wheels, the pounding of hooves, the crack of a whip, growing louder until it seemed a full team of horses and a heavy carriage was racing toward them. The ground might even shake, and yet when they looked, no physical coach appeared. At other times, the sight was visible but terrifying. A spectral carriage glowing faintly, drawn by horses with eyes like fire, racing down the road only to vanish into darkness or dissolve at the crossroads. Witnesses swore the phantom coach could pass straight through gates, hedgerows, and even stone walls, leaving no trace behind. These ghostly coaches were often tied to stories of the damned. Many traditions claimed that they were driven by souls who could not rest, condemned to repeat their journeys forever. In some cases, the coach was linked to a particular figure, a cruel squire, a corrupt judge, or a heartless nobleman whose sins in life had doomed them to this endless ride. The carriage was their punishment, carrying them through the countryside where they had once lived, now as a warning to others. Villagers would point to certain lanes and say that on stormy nights, the phantom coach of a long-dead master could still be heard thundering by. One of the best-known examples is the story of the coach of Lady Howard of Tavistock in Devon. Lady Howard was remembered as a wicked woman who mistreated her husbands and tenants. After her death, legend said that she was doomed to ride each night from her former home in a coach made of bones, drawn by headless horses. Inside sat a spectral dog, her only companion, and the journey repeated endlessly, her punishment for her cruelty in life. This tale captured imaginations for generations, with locals warning against being on the road during her ride. The phantom coach also served as an omen. In many places, its appearance was said to foretell death. To hear the rumbling wheels, or to glimpse the spectral horses, was a sign that someone in the community would soon die, much like the omen beasts of earlier stories. This belief tied the coach to the larger tradition of death portents, reinforcing the sense that the supernatural was not random but meaningful, delivering warnings that could not be ignored. Alongside the phantom coach were the legends of headless riders, figures who combined the terror of the human ghost with the uncanny sight of a body missing its most essential part. The headless rider was reported across many parts of England, often tied to specific sites such as battlefields, gallows, or churchyards. These places of death provided natural homes for such figures, and the rider became a kind of restless revenant, forever repeating the motions of life without the fullness of humanity. The image of the headless horseman was powerful in part because of its ambiguity. Some stories describe the rider carrying his own head beneath his arm, its face pale and grim. Others said the head was absent entirely, leaving a gaping void above the shoulders. In either case, the figure inspired terror. To see such a rider on a lonely road at night was to feel that the natural order had been overturned, that life and death no longer held their proper boundaries. Explanations for the headless rider varied. Some said they were victims of execution, men who had been beheaded for crimes or rebellion, doomed to wander as punishment. Others claimed they were lords or knights who had been struck down in battle, their heads taken by enemies, their spirits unable to rest without them. In a few cases, the rider was portrayed as hunting, chasing through the night without end, accompanied by spectral hounds. This last version blurred into the imagery of the wild hunt, connecting the headless rider to the larger theme of ghostly cavalcades that swept across the land. As with the phantom coach, these riders were often omens. To encounter one was to risk death or misfortune. Stories warned that those who stood in the path of the rider might be struck down, while others claimed that to look directly into the face of a severed head was to invite madness. Communities treated such places with caution, avoiding certain roads or times of night. Even if no one alive had recently seen the headless rider, the memory of his presence shaped behavior. The combination of the coach and the rider also appeared in some traditions. A headless driver was said to guide a spectral carriage, the reins held in hands that could not see, the horses galloping blindly into the night. This blending of motifs created an even more terrifying vision, one that suggested total abandonment of order, a vehicle without guidance, a rider without a head, rushing through the countryside as a symbol of chaos and doom. What makes these stories particularly striking is how closely they tied to real fears of travel. Before modern roads and lighting, journeys at night were dangerous. Accidents with carriages and horses were common, and travellers risked robbery or worse. The phantom coach and headless rider embodied these fears in supernatural form. They were reminders that the road could be deadly, that misfortune could strike without warning, and that those who perished on such journeys might not rest easily. Literature preserved and expanded these figures. In Gothic novels of the 18th and 19th centuries, ghostly coaches and headless riders were common motifs, used to create atmosphere and dread. They entered ballads and plays, their imagery carried beyond the villages where the tales had first been told. The headless rider, in particular, became a universal symbol, appearing in English stories, but also influencing traditions abroad, from Ireland to America, where Washington Irving would immortalize the figure in the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Though that version became most famous, its roots lie firmly in the European and English traditions of spectral riders. Even today, echoes of these legends linger. Tour guides in historic towns point to roads where phantom coaches were once said to pass. Old inns and manor houses claim sightings of headless riders. The stories, though softened by time, continue to serve their old function. They make the familiar strange, reminding us that ordinary places, the road outside town, the churchyard at midnight, can become uncanny when viewed through the lens of folklore. From the sound of spectral wheels and the pounding of unseen hooves, the imagination moves towards smaller yet equally powerful figures, the Faeries of the English countryside. If phantom coaches and headless riders belong to the great roads and lonely lanes, then the Pixies and Pucks belong to the fields, hills, and woodlands, forever close at hand, mischievous and unpredictable in their dealings with mortals. If the phantom coaches and headless riders belong to the night roads, then the countryside itself, with its hedgerows, green hills, and deep woods, was thought to belong to the Faeries. In England, stories of these beings were as common as the fields themselves, woven into the rhythm of rural life. They were not all of one kind. Some were tiny, mischievous creatures called Pixies. Others were more imposing, like the household Hobgoblins, and still others were tricksters and shapeshifters like Puck. Together, they formed a world of beings who lived just alongside the human one, invisible to most, but capable of influence both for good and ill. To walk through the countryside was to walk through their domain, and the line between safety and danger depended on how a person treated them. The Pixie was perhaps the most familiar of these figures, especially in the West Country. People in Devon and Cornwall spoke often of Pixies, describing them as small, childlike figures with pointed features, who delighted in playing tricks on humans. They were said to dance in rings on the grass, leaving behind the mysterious circles later called fairy rings. To step into one of these was dangerous, for those caught inside might be forced to dance until exhaustion claimed them, or might vanish entirely into the other world. Farmers and shepherds swore that pixies could lead travellers astray, turning familiar paths into mazes so that men wandered for hours in their own fields. This condition was known as being pixie-led, and the only cure was to turn one's coat inside out or to carry an iron nail, both of which were believed to break the spell. Despite their mischief, pixies were not always malevolent. They could sometimes help with chores, especially if they were treated with respect. Small gifts of food were said to please them, much like brownies and hobgoblins in other regions. Yet their help was unpredictable, and to rely upon them was unwise. They were first and foremost tricksters, and stories of their antics were told with both amusement and caution. In some tales, they appeared kindly, guiding lost travelers back to safety. In others, they led them straight into bogs or over cliffs. The unpredictability of the Pixies reflected the unpredictability of rural life itself, where fortune could shift in an instant. While Pixies belonged mainly to the southwest, Puck was a figure remembered across much of England. Known also as Robin Goodfellow, Puck was a fairy trickster whose presence was felt in countless pranks and confusions. Shakespeare immortalized him in A Midsummer Night's Dream, portraying him as a mischievous servant of the fairy king Oberon, delighting in causing lovers to quarrel and mortals to stumble. But the figure of Puck was older than Shakespeare. In folk tradition, he was the spirit of mischief itself, able to change form, vanish, or appear suddenly to startle travelers. His tricks ranged from harmless, misleading someone on the road, tangling hair, blowing out lamps, to more dangerous acts like leading men into marshes or frightening horses at night. The duality of Puck's character is important. He could be called Robin Goodfellow when he helped with chores or offered guidance, and simply Puck when his tricks were cruel. This reflected a broader truth about the fairy world. It was neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but capricious, following its own rules. Mortals who treated fairies with respect might enjoy moments of aid, but those who mocked them or dismissed them were likely to regret it. Beyond Pixies and Puck, the English countryside was thought to be alive with a host of lesser fairies. Some lived in hills or barrows, their homes invisible from the outside, but filled with light and music within. These fairies were often seen dancing on moonlit nights, and to hear their music was both enchanting and dangerous. Those who joined the dance risked losing hours, days, or even years, for time passed differently in the fairy realm. Others were believed to live in springs, groves, or standing stones, places that carried an atmosphere of mystery. These locations became points of caution in local tradition, with warnings not to disturb them or to trespass lightly. A recurring theme in English fairy lore is the abduction of humans. Many stories tell of fairies stealing children from their cradles and leaving behind changelings, sickly fairy children who resembled the original but never thrived. Parents who noticed sudden changes in their infants, loss of appetite, strange behavior, or unexplained illness, sometimes blamed the fairies. Remedies varied. Some placed iron near the cradle. Others tried to trick the changeling into revealing itself by shocking or startling it. The fear of changelings was very real, reflecting both the fragility of childhood in earlier centuries and the attempt to explain the tragedies that parents faced. Adults too could be taken. Tales tell of young men or women lured into the fairy realm by beauty, music, or promises of delight. Some returned after what felt like a single night, only to find that years had passed in the mortal world. Others never returned at all. These stories warned listeners of the dangers of temptation, of being seduced away from human responsibilities by pleasures that were not meant for mortals. At the same time, they reflected a deep cultural sense that another world lay just beside the visible one, a world both alluring and perilous. The connection between fairies and nature was always strong. They were tied to the fertility of the land, to the growth of crops, and to the well-being of animals. Farmers were cautious about cutting certain hedges or ploughing over old mounds for fear of offending the fairy folk. Even in the 19th century, there are records of rural people leaving small patches of land untouched, called fairy fields, where no plough would pass. These customs reveal how seriously such beliefs were taken, even as modernity advanced. The church's stance on fairies was complex. Some clergy condemned them outright as demons, servants of the devil seeking to lead mortals astray. Others tolerated the stories as harmless superstitions. In practice, people often blended beliefs, attending church while still leaving offerings for the fairies, or avoiding places said to be theirs. The persistence of fairy lore shows that, whatever the official teaching, the sense of an unseen presence in the countryside remained strong. Literature and drama gave fairies an enduring cultural role. Shakespeare's portrayal of Puck and the fairy court fixed certain images in the imagination, but folk versions remained wilder and less refined. Later poets and writers, especially in the Romantic period, took up the fairy tradition, sometimes softening it into something charming and whimsical. Yet in the countryside, the older stories of danger and abduction still circulated. Even as fairies entered children's books and plays, rural families remembered them as forces to be respected, not trifled with. The endurance of fairy lore in England reveals much about how people related to their landscape. To live in a world of uncertain harvests, sudden storms, and unexplained illness was to live surrounded by mysteries. Fairies gave those mysteries a face. They explained why crops failed, why travelers became lost, and why children sickened without cause. They also embodied the beauty of the countryside, its music, its moonlight, its hidden glens. The duality of fairies, mischievous but also enchanting, mirrored the duality of nature itself, a source of both bounty and peril. From the tiny footprints in the grass to the sound of laughter in empty fields, the presence of fairies lingered across England well into the modern age. They were less terrifying than dragons or omen beasts, but in some ways more unsettling, for they lived so close to home, always just out of sight. To speak of them was to acknowledge that the world was not empty, but inhabited by presences beyond human comprehension. From the playful mischief of Pixies and the trickery of Puck, the imagination turns to a darker kind of haunting, objects that carried their own uncanny power. If fairies revealed the vitality of the landscape, then the screaming skulls of English manor houses revealed the persistence of the dead within human dwellings, voices of the past refusing to be silenced. Across England, in scattered villages and ancient manor houses, there are stories of skulls that refuse to rest quietly in their graves. These are not simply relics of the dead, but objects that seem to hold a will of their own, demanding to remain in the houses where they have long been kept. Known as screaming skulls, they form one of the strangest strands of English folklore. The belief was that to remove such a skull from its chosen home was to invite disaster. Storms would break out, cattle would sicken, buildings would collapse, and above all, the skull would make its displeasure known by screaming until it was returned. These tales blended the ghost story with the relic, turning bones into protectors, punishers, and guardians of place. The most famous of these skulls is perhaps that of Bettiscombe in Dorset. The story goes that in the 18th century, a Jamaican servant of the manor, facing death in a foreign land, begged to be buried in his native soil. His master ignored the wish and buried him in the local churchyard. Not long after, strange screams were heard, and misfortunes plagued the household. The body was exhumed, and eventually only the skull was kept in the house. From then on, it was said that the house would know no peace if the skull were ever removed. Generations repeated the tale, swearing that any attempt to take the skull away brought calamity until it was restored. Bettiscombe was not alone. Across the country, other houses claimed their own skulls with similar reputations. In Wardley Hall in Lancashire, a skull believed to belong to a Catholic martyr was said to rest uneasily, protesting any disturbance. In Burton Agnes Hall in Yorkshire, the skull of a young woman was kept within the walls after she died under tragic circumstances. She was said to have begged that her head remain in the house she loved, and when her wishes were ignored, her ghost screamed and wailed until the skull was returned. These stories followed a pattern, a promise or a will left unfulfilled, followed by supernatural unrest that only the presence of the skull could calm. What makes the Screaming Skull legends so fascinating is the way they blend respect for the dead with fear of their power. Skulls were not just bones, they were seen as vessels of identity, carrying something essential of the person they once belonged to. In a culture that already treated relics, saints' bones, holy remains, with reverence, it is perhaps unsurprising that ordinary skulls, tied to strong legends, could take on similar weight. To remove them was not simply to move an object, it was to break a bond with the spirit world. The screams themselves were rarely described in detail, but accounts suggest they were terrifying. Unnatural cries that filled the house, making sleep impossible and driving people to restore the skull. The very idea of a skull producing sound without lungs or flesh is uncanny, and it is this impossibility that gave the tales their force. To imagine a skull screaming is to confront directly the refusal of the dead to stay silent. The role of these skulls was not always wholly negative. In many cases, once the skull was left in peace, it was said to protect the house. Storms passed it by, livestock thrived, and misfortune was kept at bay. The skull became a kind of guardian, its presence ensuring stability. The danger lay not in the skull itself, but in disturbing it. Families who inherited such objects often treated them with respect, passing down the warning that the skull must never be removed. In this way, the legend became part of the identity of the house, a tradition that tied generations together. Skeptics might say that these were simply stories invented to explain odd misfortunes or to add mystery to an old house. But to those who lived with the skulls, the belief was real. Visitors who scoffed at the tales sometimes found themselves unnerved by sudden noises or accidents. Locals repeated the stories with conviction, pointing to centuries of continuity. Whether or not the screams were ever truly heard, the idea that they could be was enough to shape behavior and keep the skulls in place. The Screaming Skulls also reveal something about the English relationship with the past. Manor houses were not just homes, but repositories of history, filled with relics, portraits, and memorials of ancestors. The skull, as both relic and warning, symbolized the inescapable presence of the dead within the living household. Families who kept them were reminded daily of their ancestors, not as gentle memories, but as demanding presences, ensuring that promises were kept and traditions respected. These tales also blur the line between ghost story and object lore. In most ghost stories, the spirit is separate from the body, appearing in spectral form. In the Screaming Skull legends, the object itself, the bone, is the ghost. The skull does not merely signify the dead, it embodies them. This distinction gives the tales a material quality that is rare in folklore, grounding the supernatural in something tangible that can be pointed to, touched, and feared. Not all Screaming Skulls were tied to great houses. In some rural cottages, families kept skulls said to belong to ancestors or victims of injustice. One such tale tells of a skull that, if removed, would cause the roof to leak until it was returned. Another warned of fields lying fallow if the skull was disturbed. In these humbler versions, the skulls served the same function: anchors of continuity, binding the living to the promises and memories of the dead. Literature and antiquarian records of the 18th and 19th centuries helped preserve these stories. Collectors of folklore were fascinated by the idea of objects with voices, and they published accounts of skulls in magazines and local histories. This ensured that even as belief waned, the tales endured, woven into the wider fabric of English ghost lore. Today, visitors to places like Burton Agnes or Bettiscombe are still told of the skulls, even if the actual bones may have been removed or lost. The stories remain, passed on as part of the identity of the place. There is also a broader symbolism to these tales. The screaming skulls can be seen as representations of unresolved issues, of promises broken or duties neglected. They are not the peaceful dead, but the demanding dead, reminding the living that the past cannot be so easily silenced. Their screams are the cries of memory itself, forcing attention to what has been forgotten or ignored. In this sense, the folklore speaks not only to fear of the supernatural, but also to the weight of obligation across generations. From skulls that scream within the walls of manor houses, the imagination shifts outward again to those who dealt most directly with such matters in everyday life. The cunning folk. These were the men and women called upon to quiet restless spirits, to break curses, to heal illnesses believed to be caused by witchcraft, and to protect against the unseen. If the screaming skulls show the persistence of the dead within the household, the cunning folk reveal how the living try to manage and negotiate with such forces in the broader community. In every village across England, there were stories of witches, women, and sometimes men who were said to blight crops, curdle milk, or send illness through malice or pact with darker powers. Yet there was another group whose place in the imagination was more complicated: the cunning folk. These were the charmers, healers, and wise people who offered protection against witchcraft and guidance in times of uncertainty. Their role was ambiguous, caught between acceptance and suspicion, but for centuries, they were an indispensable part of rural life. To speak of the cunning folk is to speak of how ordinary people dealt with the constant presence of the supernatural, not in great battles of saints or knights, but in the daily struggles of health, harvest, and household fortune. The cunning man or woman was not usually seen as evil. On the contrary, they were often sought out by neighbours in times of trouble. If a cow stopped giving milk, if butter refused to churn, if illness struck a child without clear cause, families turned to the cunning folk for answers. They offered remedies made of herbs, charms written on parchment, or rituals performed with words and symbols. These practices drew on a mixture of older traditions, scraps of medieval medicine, and Christian prayers, woven together into something both practical and mystical. For those who relied on them, the cunning folk were protectors, standing between the ordinary world and the unseen forces that threatened it. One of the most common services they offered was protection against witchcraft. Belief in witches was widespread, and people feared that envy or resentment from a neighbour could lead to a curse. The cunning folk provided counter magic, charms worn around the neck, bottles filled with pins and urine buried beneath the hearth, or rituals involving the burning of hair or nail clippings to break a spell. These measures gave people a sense of control, a way to fight back against dangers that otherwise seemed overwhelming. They also acted as finders. Lost property, stolen goods, or even missing animals were believed to be locatable through magical means. Some cunning folk used crystals or mirrors for scrying, gazing into reflective surfaces until visions revealed answers. Others claimed to use spirits or familiars to guide them. In some communities, their reputation was such that thieves feared being exposed by their sight, and crimes were deterred simply by the knowledge that a cunning man lived nearby. Healing was another central aspect of their work. In an age when medical knowledge was limited and doctors were scarce or expensive, the cunning folk offered remedies accessible to the poor. They knew the uses of herbs, sometimes passed down through generations, and combined these with charms or prayers. A fever might be treated with willow bark, a wound with comfrey, but always accompanied by words meant to reinforce the cure. The blend of practical and magical was not seen as contradictory. It was simply the way healing was understood. Despite their usefulness, the cunning folk were always on uncertain ground. Their practices could resemble those of witches, and suspicion was never far away. The same person who was praised for curing a child might, in another circumstance, be accused of causing harm. The line between white and black magic was never clear, and in times of fear or panic, the cunning folk could find themselves targets of the very witch hunts they had once helped fuel. During the great waves of witch trials in the 16th and 17th centuries, cunning folk were both accusers and accused. Some acted as experts, called upon to identify witches or to break their spells. Their testimony could sway juries, reinforcing the belief that witchcraft was real and dangerous. At the same time, their own practices exposed them to suspicion. Court records show cases where cunning men and women stood accused of witchcraft themselves, their remedies reinterpreted as evidence of a pact with the devil. The very skills that made them valuable made them vulnerable. The witch trials themselves revealed much about English society. Unlike on the continent, where large-scale hunts claimed thousands of lives, English trials tended to be more localized, tied to specific communities and disputes. Accusations often arose from quarrels between neighbors, from envy over livestock, or from unexplained illnesses. Fear of witches was strongest in times of social stress, harvest failures, plagues, or economic hardship. In such times, people sought explanations, and the idea of witchcraft offered one. The cunning folk, with their reputation for dealing with such forces, became central figures in this drama. One of the most notorious episodes was the work of Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witchfinder general in the 1640s. Hopkins and his associates travelled through East Anglia, accusing dozens of women of witchcraft. Their methods relied heavily on supposed signs, the presence of familiars, marks on the body, or confessions extracted under duress. Cunning folk were sometimes called upon during these hunts, either to confirm suspicions or, in some cases, as targets themselves. The hysteria of the period shows how deeply ingrained belief in witchcraft was, and how even those who tried to protect against it were not safe from its accusations. Yet outside these periods of panic, cunning folk often thrived. Well into the 18th and 19th centuries, rural communities continued to rely on them. Folklorists recorded accounts of people carrying charms written by local wise women or consulting cunning men to discover who had bewitched their cattle. These practices persisted even as scientific medicine advanced, showing how enduring the belief in unseen forces remained. For many, the cunning folk provided something doctors could not: reassurance that their problems had meaning and could be confronted through familiar rituals. The survival of these traditions also reveals how deeply magic was embedded in everyday life. Charms and counterspells were not exotic but commonplace, woven into the routines of farming and family life. A nail driven into a doorway, a horseshoe hung above a barn, a bottle buried beneath the hearth. These were ordinary precautions, as much a part of household management as tending the fire or storing grain. The cunning folk were simply the recognized experts, the ones who knew how to make such practices most effective. The stories of cunning folk are filled with ambiguity. Some were remembered as wise and kind, healers who brought comfort and protection. Others were feared, their power seen as dangerous or double-edged. In some cases, the same individual could be viewed both ways, depending on the outcome of their work. Success brought gratitude and reputation. Failure bred suspicion and fear. This ambiguity reflects the larger theme of English folklore itself, where figures are rarely wholly good or wholly evil, but complex, unpredictable, and shaped by the needs of the community. Literature and later popular culture often softened the image of cunning folk, turning them into quaint figures of local colour. In Victorian collections of folklore, they were sometimes portrayed as rustic magicians, harmless eccentrics whose charms amused more than frightened. Yet the older stories remind us that their role was much more serious. For centuries, they were the ones people turned to in times of real crisis, when illness threatened, or when unseen forces seemed to press too close. Their place in the community was not ornamental, but vital. From the cunning folk, with their charms and counterspells, the imagination turns naturally to the spirits of the dead that lingered in larger numbers. If witches and their hunters showed the tension between human and supernatural power, then the tales of phantom armies and battlefield ghosts revealed the lingering presence of violence itself. Armies that did not rest even when the living had moved on. From charms whispered over sick children, the stories now carry us to fields where entire hosts of the dead were said to march, echoes of England's long and bloody history. The English landscape is marked by centuries of conflict, from Roman conquests to medieval wars, from civil strife to skirmishes on the borders. Countless lives were lost in fields, forests, and along roads that today seem quiet. Yet folklore insists that the dead did not always rest. Again and again, people spoke of phantom armies, restless hosts who continued to march, clash, and cry out long after their bodies were laid in the earth. These were not ordinary ghosts, single figures haunting a house or churchyard, but entire gatherings of the dead, replaying battles in endless cycles that terrified those who encountered them. The idea of armies lingering after death was not new. Chroniclers, as early as the Middle Ages, recorded sightings of spectral hosts in the skies, armies marching with banners unfurled, their weapons glinting in phantom light. These accounts often interpreted the visions as omens, warnings of wars yet to come, or divine judgments upon sinful nations. But in popular tradition, the phantom army was less a prophecy than a memory, the restless spirit of violence imprinted on the land itself. To see such a host was to be reminded that bloodshed left marks that time could not erase. One of the most enduring traditions concerns the Battle of Edgehill, fought in 1642 during the English Civil War. It was said that not long after the clash, villagers began to report strange sights and sounds on the battlefield. They claimed to hear the shouts of soldiers, the clash of steel, and even to see figures in armour fighting in the night air. Some said the battle replayed itself, with ghostly armies engaging again and again as though the dead could not accept their fate. The reports were so persistent that even King Charles III is said to have sent investigators. Whether or not the royal agents truly witnessed the ghostly battle, the story spread widely, cementing Edgehill as one of England's most haunted fields. Other battlefields carried similar reputations. Towton, in Yorkshire, the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the Wars of the Roses, was long said to echo with cries on stormy nights. People walking near the field reported hearing the clash of weapons or seeing fleeting shapes in the mist. At Sedgemoor, where the Monmouth Rebellion ended in 1685, locals spoke of phantom soldiers marching across the marshes, their muskets on their shoulders, forever retracing their last steps. These accounts made the past a living presence, the dead refusing to fade into memory. Not all phantom armies were tied to specific battles. Some were said to appear in more general ways, hosts of armed men marching across the sky or along roads. These visions often came at times of crisis, reinforcing their role as omens. Chroniclers in the 12th and 13th centuries described vast spectral hosts passing overhead, sometimes interpreted as signs of coming war, sometimes as armies of the damned. The sight of soldiers marching where none should be was a powerful image, one that spoke to the inseparability of violence and fate in the medieval imagination. The restless dead were not limited to armies. Individual soldiers, too, were said to haunt the places where they fell. Travellers told of encountering figures in armour standing silently by crossroads, or of hearing the sound of drums and trumpets with no source. In some tales, these ghosts sought recognition, demanding that their graves be tended or their memory honoured. In others, they seemed trapped in endless repetition, carrying out the motions of battle with no awareness of the living. The battlefield ghost was thus both a warning and a reminder, a figure that insisted that the cost of war could not be forgotten. Folklorists have suggested that the persistence of such tales reflects the trauma of war upon communities. For those who lived near battlefields, the memory of violence was never far away. Bones were unearthed in fields, weapons were found in the soil, and stories of slaughter were passed down through generations. The belief that the dead continued to fight gave voice to this enduring presence of conflict. Even when the armies were gone, their shadows lingered, shaping the identity of the land. The phantom armies also connected to broader European traditions of the wild hunt and spectral hosts, where the dead were imagined as moving in groups rather than as individuals. In England, these traditions blended with the memory of real battles, grounding the vision of ghostly hosts in specific history. This fusion of myth and memory gave the stories both power and credibility. To speak of the ghosts of Edgehill was to speak not only of spirits, but of a battle that had truly scarred the nation. Witness accounts often emphasized sound as much as sight. People described hearing the tramp of boots, the neighing of horses, the distant roar of commands. These sounds, heard in the silence of night, created an atmosphere of dread. Even if no figures were seen, the noises alone were enough to convince people that armies were still present. The auditory nature of the haunting made it harder to dismiss. A sound in the dark could not be explained away as easily as a trick of the eyes. Over time, these stories were incorporated into local identity. Villages near haunted battlefields repeated the tales as part of their heritage. Some treated the phantom armies with a degree of pride, as proof that their land had witnessed great history. Others feared them, avoiding the fields after dark. In both cases, the legends ensured that the memory of past violence remained active, not confined to books or monuments, but alive in the voices of the people. Literature drew upon these traditions as well, Gothic writers found in Phantom Armies a rich source of atmosphere, blending historical memory with supernatural dread. Ballads and poems spoke of soldiers marching forever, of drums that never ceased. Even in modern times, ghost stories set on English battlefields continue to draw on the imagery of restless hosts, keeping the tradition alive in new forms. The concept of phantom armies reveals something essential about English folklore. Unlike the solitary ghost that haunts a house, the army is collective, reflecting not only personal but communal trauma. These stories remind us that war is not an individual event, but one that leaves entire landscapes marked, entire generations affected. The restless dead of the battlefield embody this communal memory, demanding recognition long after peace has supposedly been restored. From the clash of ghostly weapons and the tramp of unseen feet, the imagination turns toward the final theme: how all these stories, from dragons to fairies, from Omen beasts to phantom armies, continue to echo in the modern world. If phantom hosts remind us of the persistence of history, then the enduring echoes of folklore show how deeply these tales still shape identity and imagination in England today. When people today walk through the English countryside, they see green fields, villages with centuries-old churches, hedgerows, and winding lanes. The land seems settled, mapped, and familiar. Yet woven through it is another landscape, less visible but no less real, the one shaped by centuries of folklore. The dragons, witches, fairies, omen beasts, spectral coaches, and phantom armies may not be spoken of with the same intensity as in past centuries, but they linger in memory, in stories told to children, in literature, and even in the way people sense certain places. Folklore has a way of persisting, not because everyone still believes in the creatures themselves, but because the tales continue to carry meaning, shaping imagination and cultural identity in subtle and enduring ways. One of the clearest echoes lies in language. Even today, expressions like being pixie-led or seeing a will-o'-the-wisp survive in everyday speech, long after the literal belief has faded. These phrases remind us of a time when such beings were seen as active presences, influencing how people understood misfortune, confusion, or strangeness. The words remain because the experiences they describe are universal: getting lost in the countryside, being deceived by false lights, feeling as though unseen hands are playing tricks. Folklore gave those moments a name, and the names have endured. Literature has preserved and expanded the imagery of English folklore. Shakespeare immortalised Puck as Robin Goodfellow, while later poets and novelists drew upon the traditions of fairies, witches, and haunted places. Gothic writers used phantom coaches and restless dead to create atmosphere, and romantic poets softened the fairy world into symbols of nature and imagination. Even in the 20th century, fantasy writers tapped into these deep wells of tradition. Creatures like the Grindylow and the Barghest reappeared in novels and stories, reimagined for new audiences, but always carrying echoes of their older forms. The popularity of these figures shows how adaptable folklore is, able to shift shape while retaining its core essence. Children's literature, too, has played a powerful role. Victorian collections of fairy tales turned older, darker beings into more whimsical figures, giving children a version of folklore that was less threatening, but still filled with wonder. This softening meant that stories of brownies, pixies, and household spirits survived in nursery books, even if the harsher warnings were stripped away. In this way, folklore entered the lives of generations not as superstition, but as imagination, nurturing a sense of enchantment that could grow into adulthood. Beyond books, folklore survives in local identity. Villages still boast of their haunted inns, their local black dogs, their fairy fields left unploughed. Tourism has helped keep many of these stories alive, with guides and plaques repeating the legends to visitors. In some cases, the folklore is as much a part of the place as its physical landmarks. York, for example, is known as one of the most haunted cities in England, and the tale of the Barghest is part of its cultural fabric. Cornwall and Devon celebrate their Pixie traditions, while Dorset still recalls the story of Betiscombe's skull. These stories give places character, connecting the present to the past in ways that statistics or dates never could. Folklore also persists in popular imagination through the idea of the uncanny in the landscape. Even if one does not literally believe in fairies or omen beasts, there is a lingering sense that certain places carry a special atmosphere. A lonely churchyard at night, a misty moor, a bridge over dark water, all evoke feelings of unease or wonder that align with old tales. People may not speak of Jenny Greenteeth when avoiding a pond, but the inherited caution remains. The folklore has shaped the way generations experience the land, and that influence still lingers, often unconsciously. Modern media continues to draw on these traditions. Films, television series, and games reimagine English folklore for new audiences, mixing the old with the new. The figure of the Headless rider appears in horror stories and dramas, while the fairies of the countryside inspire both light-hearted fantasy and darker, uncanny interpretations. Local legends are reworked into detective stories, ghost tales, and supernatural fiction, keeping the characters of folklore alive in contemporary storytelling. The adaptability of these figures shows their resilience. They can be frightening or whimsical, omens or companions, depending on what the times demand. The enduring appeal of folklore lies partly in its ability to speak to universal concerns. Death, fortune, illness, the unknown. These were the subjects of the old stories, and they remain central to human life. The black dogs that foretold death reflected anxieties about mortality, just as the screaming skulls reflected unease about obligations to the dead. The Witch-Hares embodied fears about envy and malice within communities, while the Cunning folk symbolized the desire for protection and guidance. These themes are timeless, even if the details shift. Folklore remains relevant because it addresses questions that never fully disappear. Another reason for its persistence is its grounding in place. Unlike myths that belong to distant ages or foreign lands, English folklore is tied to specific lanes, fields, and houses. The Barguest belongs to York, Peg Powler to the River Tees, the Witch-Hare to rural farms, the skull to its manor. This rootedness makes the stories difficult to erase. Even if belief fades, the places remain, and with them, the associations. Walking the same ground keeps the tales alive, generation after generation. In modern England, folklore also serves as a way of connecting with heritage. In a rapidly changing world, where technology transforms daily life and landscapes shift, these stories provide continuity. They remind people that the land is not empty, but filled with memory. They connect present communities to ancestors who told the same tales centuries ago. Even if no one truly fears the Barguest at the city gate, the story links the people of York today with those of the past, creating a shared cultural thread. The fascination with folklore also reflects a continued desire for mystery. In an age when so much can be explained, the idea that certain places or experiences remain uncanny is compelling. Ghost walks, folklore festivals, and reimaginings of old tales attract audiences precisely because they offer something beyond the ordinary. The persistence of these traditions suggests that however rational modern life becomes, there remains a hunger for the strange, the uncanny, and the enchanted. Folklore also influences how people see themselves. The figure of the cunning folk, for example, reflects the value placed on knowledge and protection within communities. The enduring stories of witches highlight anxieties about outsiders or those who defy social norms. Fairy lore reflects a relationship with nature that is both fearful and reverent. By remembering and retelling these stories, communities continue to explore questions about identity, morality, and the balance between human and supernatural. Even in everyday superstition, echoes remain. Horseshoes nailed above doors, charms against bad luck, or reluctance to disturb certain old sites, all carry shades of older beliefs. Few may consciously connect these acts to folklore, but the roots are there, showing how deeply the old traditions shaped habits. Folklore endures not only in stories told aloud, but in gestures, symbols, and customs passed on quietly. From dragons slain by saints to spectral armies on battlefields, from pixies in the fields to skulls in the halls of manors, English folklore offers a panorama of beings and beliefs that continue to shape imagination. These figures may no longer be feared in the way they once were, but they remain alive in memory, in language, and in the stories that people still choose to tell. They give depth to the land, reminding us that every lane, every hill, every river carries not only its physical presence, but its unseen stories. And so the echoes of folklore endure, shaping not only how people once explained their world, but how modern generations continue to experience it. The myths and legends of England are not relics to be locked away, but living parts of imagination, shifting with each retelling, carrying forward the voices of the past into the present, and ensuring that the landscape will never be entirely ordinary.